You're always a step behind the moment. Think about it. The second you say, "This is now," it's already behind you. It passed. It became memory. So if you can only name the present after it's gone, did you ever really touch it? Try it right now. Say the word "now" out loud. By the time the sound leaves your lips, the moment you meant has already moved on. The word describes something that existed just a fraction of a second ago. It's not now anymore. It's then. And this isn't just about language. It's about awareness. You react to something, then your brain interprets it, and only after that do you think, "This is happening." But by then, the thing already happened. You're looking at a shadow of the moment, always, constantly. I'd love to invite you to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It's incredible to think about how we're all connected through these stories and ideas. If you enjoy these thought-provoking explorations, consider subscribing to Tired Thinker so we can keep bringing you reflective narratives. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let your imagination drift as we delve into the mind-boggling paradoxes and mysteries. That's not metaphor. It's how your brain works. There's a delay between your senses and your conscious mind. Even with no distractions, no hesitation, you're still working on a small lag, around 80 milliseconds or so. That's fast. It's so fast you can't notice, but it's still behind, like driving while only looking through a camera with a tiny bit of lag, enough to react, but never quite real time. Now picture this. You're standing still, thinking you're in the moment. Your phone buzzes. You feel it, you look, you process. All of that is behind the moment. It already occurred. Even the feeling itself, that vibration, is something your brain interpreted from raw signals sent milliseconds ago. You're not feeling the present. You're feeling the past, disguised as the present. So what is now? Is it just a moving target? Or worse, is it an illusion? You might say, okay, but I can still act in the present. I can jump, move, speak, make a decision. But even that decision has a delay. Your brain fires signals, muscles react. By the time the action starts, your body has already cued the process. You're the last to know, and it gets stranger. The more you chase now, the more it runs. There is no boundary, no line in time where the future stops and the present begins. It's not like stepping from one room into another. You're on a treadmill that's always just outpacing your feet. In physics, we try to define now with precision. In relativity, though, the concept doesn't even hold up. Two observers moving at different speeds might not even agree on what now is. What you think is the present, someone else sees as the past or the future. Now becomes something personal, subjective, not a universal truth. Still, you might say, okay, maybe we can't pin it down perfectly, but surely we can live in the present. That's different, right? Well, can we? Even the idea of being present relies on memory and attention. You have to recognize what's happening. But recognition is a process, and once you've recognized it, it's over. You're experiencing what just happened, not what's happening. It's like chasing your own shadow. The closer you get, the more it slips away. The more aware you try to be of the moment, the more you realize the moment already passed. And that's unsettling, because it means we're never truly in sync with time. We live just behind it, always reacting, never really being. Consider a camera that takes a photo every second. You see the photos later, you arrange them in order, you can say what happened, but you didn't live in the pictures. You lived between them, in a blur. That blur, that tiny, fast-moving gap, is where we exist. So maybe now isn't something we catch. Maybe it's something we invent. A tool, a word we use to talk about the blurry zone between what just happened and what hasn't happened yet. A way to make peace with never quite catching up. You don't sit in now. You move through it. You skim the surface. You leave a trail. And the trail is all you really get to hold. Even when you meditate, when you focus your breath, slow down, empty your thoughts, you still only notice the breath after it enters or exits. You label it. You reflect on it. But you never actually touch it while it's happening. It's gone the moment it arrives. And yet we're obsessed with the present. We're told to live in the moment, be mindful, focus. But if the moment is always out of reach, what does that advice even mean? Is it possible to live in something that vanishes as soon as you see it? Try this thought. Maybe the present isn't for living in. Maybe it's for flowing through. You don't grab it. You don't pause it. You move with it. like standing in a river. You never touch the same water twice, and the water you're standing in, by the time you feel it, is already past you. And maybe that's okay. Maybe being alive is not about catching the moment, but surfing the delay. Maybe the human experience is designed to be slightly behind, like echoing through space. Not broken, just tuned a few steps off from real time. Still, that question lingers. Can you ever reach now? Say it again. Now. Hear it. Watch the moment pass. Try to hold it, and it slides through your hands like light. Every time you notice it, you're too late. And somehow, that makes it even more real. Imagine someone looks you dead in the eyes and says, "I always lie." At first, it sounds simple. Maybe they're just being honest about being dishonest. But then the sentence folds in on itself. Because if what they just said is true, then they're lying, which makes it false. But if it's false, meaning they don't always lie, then this statement itself might be the truth, which would make it true. But that would make them a liar again. And around it goes. You've just stepped into one of the simplest but most mind-warping paradoxes in logic. It's often called the liar paradox. It doesn't need any math. It doesn't need philosophy degrees. Just a few words and your brain's spinning. Let's try to break it down slowly, without the spin. First, assume the statement is true. They say, "I always lie," and we believe them. That means that every single thing they say is false, including this current statement. But if this statement is a lie, then it's not true that they always lie, which means that they sometimes tell the truth. That already breaks the original claim. Okay, now flip it. What if the statement is false? That would mean the claim, "I always lie," is a lie. So they're not always lying. That means sometimes, maybe even now, they're telling the truth. But wait, that makes the statement true again. It loops right back around. This is what makes it a paradox. It doesn't neatly resolve. It's like a verbal version of chasing your tail. The moment you think you've caught the meaning, it slips through and reverses. Let's step into a little story to see it play out in a conversation. You walk into a room where someone claims to be a liar. You ask them a simple yes or no question, like, "Is the sky blue?" They say yes. But then they follow with, "By the way, I always lie." Now your brain's juggling too much. Did they just lie about the sky being blue? Or about always lying? One of those statements has to break for the rest to stand. And the paradox isn't just a word game, it has real implications in logic and computer science. In formal systems, statements like these cause systems to crash or produce undefined behavior. In AI, for example, if a system tries to evaluate the truth of its own logic using self-referential statements, it can run into these feedback loops that don't resolve. It's like asking a program to delete itself, then run. It's an instruction that undoes itself. Now, take a second to think about this in terms of trust. Say you're in a courtroom and a witness takes the stand and says, "Everything I say is a lie." That means their testimony is unreliable. But if they're lying about always lying, they could be telling the truth now. You can't trust or dismiss their words without twisting yourself into a logical pretzel. What's most strange is that the sentence doesn't break any grammar rules. It's perfectly normal English. The problem is with its structure. It references itself in a way that cancels itself out. It's like writing a note that says, "This note is false." It looks fine, but it pinned down whether it's true or false, and it slips through your fingers. It's not the only statement that behaves this way either. There are other, more disguised versions. For example, imagine two people in a room. Person A says, "Person B always lies," and person B says, "Person A always tells the truth." Now, who do you trust? You can go in circles trying to figure out if one's echoing the other, if they're both lying, or if one just happens to be telling the truth this time. It becomes a maze, even though you're only working with a few simple sentences. Back to the original paradox. There's another way to look at it. What if the person isn't lying all the time? Maybe they lie often, or even most of the time. Then the statement, "I always lie," is just an exaggeration. In that case, they're lying about always lying, and you're back on stable ground. But the paradox only works if you assume they mean it literally. Always is what causes the trap. And notice how small the trap is. Just 4 words, "I always lie." That's all it takes to crash your logic. That's what makes it such a classic. Kids can understand it. Adults get stuck on it. You can toss it into any conversation and watch people pause mid-thought. It doesn't need science fiction or theories about time or multiverses. Just a simple sentence that folds in on itself. And it's not just a brain game, it reveals something deeper. It shows how language, logic, and meaning don't always align. You can have a grammatically correct sentence that breaks down when you try to make sense of it, which means that language isn't always a perfect tool for truth. That's kind of unsettling, especially when we rely on language to explain everything else. People have tried to solve this paradox for thousands of years. Some say the sentence has no truth value. Others argue that it's not a valid statement at all, just verbal nonsense. And others say it's a warning sign that self-reference in logic is a dangerous loop. In fact, this little sentence was the seed for big ideas in mathematics and philosophy. It even connects to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, where he showed that any logical system complex enough to include arithmetic will contain statements that can't be proven true or false within the system. That started with a move similar to this one, a sentence that refers to itself and creates an endless loop. So next time someone says, "I always lie," take a step back. Don't rush to decode it. Let the loop spin a few times. You're not supposed to win, that's the point. It's a glitch in the system, a bug in the brain, a reminder that some questions don't have answers. They just stretch your thinking and remind you how fragile truth can be when you try to pin it down too tightly. You crack an egg into a pan. You see the yellow yolk, the clear whites, and for a second you might think, this is just breakfast. But the moment you ask, where did this egg come from? Things get weird fast. Not because the answer is hard to find, but because the origin of the egg, especially the first egg, might not be as clear as it seems. It's one of the oldest philosophical questions we've ever asked. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? At first, it sounds like a joke or a riddle. But as soon as you try to answer it seriously, the question pulls you into biology, evolution, logic, and even language. Let's start by looking at the basic logic of it. If a chicken lays an egg, the chicken must come first. But if a chicken hatches from an egg, then the egg must come first. Both make sense on their own, but together, they can't both be right, at least not at the same time. That's the loop. That's what makes it a paradox. Now, look at it biologically. Most animals on Earth lay eggs. Fish, reptiles, amphibians, birds, even insects. Eggs existed for hundreds of millions of years before chickens ever appeared. So in that sense, the egg clearly came first. But this doesn't answer the question in the way most people mean it. We're not asking about the first egg ever. We're asking about the first chicken egg, specifically. That's where things get tricky. To talk about the first chicken egg, we have to define what we mean by chicken. Are we talking about a bird that's genetically 100% identical to modern chickens? Or are we okay with a very close ancestor? And what about the egg itself? Does it count as a chicken egg because it was laid by a chicken or because a chicken hatched from it? Let's take a step back and look at how evolution works. Species don't just pop into existence fully formed. They change over generations, very slowly. A bird that wasn't quite a chicken laid an egg. Inside that egg, due to a small mutation in DNA, the chick that hatched was different enough from its parents that we could call it the first true chicken. The parents weren't chickens, the baby was. In that view, the egg came first. It was the container for the genetic shift. This idea lines up with how evolutionary biology sees species boundaries, not as fixed walls, but as fuzzy lines. It's not like there was one clear day when everyone agreed, this is the first chicken. It's more that enough changes stacked up over generations, until biologists looking back could say, yes, somewhere around here, chickens began. But now we run into a new problem. What do we mean by egg? Chickens don't lay some special type of egg that didn't exist before. Their eggs are just eggs. The shape, the shell, the internal structure, they aren't radically different from the eggs of their ancestors. So does the first chicken egg look any different from the egg that came right before it? Probably not. It might have the same size, same shell thickness, same color. Nothing visible would have marked it as the one. Now imagine that egg sitting there in a nest. It's quiet, warm, ordinary. But inside it, something has changed. One or two genes. Nothing you could see with your eyes. but enough to make the chick inside just different enough to count as a new species. That's the strange part. The thing that makes it a chicken is inside it. You can't see it, but it changes everything. So when it hatches, we say, here it is, the first chicken. But the egg it came from wasn't laid by a chicken. So it was a chicken egg because it contained a chicken, but it wasn't laid by one. This is where the question breaks people's brains, because both answers can be right depending on how you define chicken egg. Is it an egg from a chicken? Then chicken came first? Is it an egg containing a chicken? Then the egg came first. Philosophers sometimes deal with this using a trick. They say the question isn't well formed. It sounds like it has one answer, but it really depends on how you define the parts. They call this a false dichotomy. It makes you pick one of two sides when the real answer might be neither or both. But let's not run to philosophy just yet. Let's test this with a made-up scenario. Imagine a bird that looks a lot like a chicken. It walks, clucks, pecks at seeds, but it's not quite a chicken. Let's call it a proto-chicken. Two proto-chickens mate, and one of them lays an egg. Something small mutates in the egg's DNA. Maybe a single base pair flips. Nothing dramatic, but it's enough. The chick hatches and has a slightly different beak, slightly different feathers, maybe a new behavior. Over time, that difference gets passed down, spreads, and defines a new group. The chick that hatched from that egg becomes the ancestor of every modern chicken. So where did the line get crossed? It happened inside the egg, not before it was laid, not after it hatched. The species shift, if you can call it that, happened in the zygote stage, at the DNA level. That leads us to a technical answer, which most evolutionary biologists agree with. The egg came first. Specifically, the egg containing the first true chicken. But notice how unsatisfying that is emotionally, because now you're thinking, but if that egg wasn't laid by a chicken, doesn't that mean it's not a chicken egg? And we're back to defining words again. That's the beauty of this question. It's simple enough for a kid to ask, but complicated enough to stump scientists and philosophers for centuries. Here's another layer. Let's say we go full circle and say, fine, the chicken came first. It just appeared one day. How? That leads into mythology, not science. In ancient cultures, they often solved this by saying a god or creator placed the chicken on Earth. End of story. That's not how science works, but it shows how deeply the question goes into human thought. It isn't just biology, it's identity, creation, and time. If the egg came first, then what laid it? Something not quite a chicken. So the first chicken came from something that wasn't a chicken. That alone is weird to think about. Your parents weren't chickens, but you are? It makes sense in evolutionary terms, but not in everyday logic. We expect clean labels. Nature doesn't care about our labels. We even get tripped up by language. The phrase chicken egg sounds simple, but it carries assumptions. We assume there's a clear line between chicken and not chicken, but that line never existed. It was a slow blur. Every generation was just a tiny bit different from the one before. So when you ask which came first, you're not really asking about eggs and chickens. You're asking about change, about identity, about how something becomes something else. You're asking, how do you know when a line has been crossed, when everything around it looks the same? And that's why the question still matters. Not because we care about chickens, but because we care about origins. We want to know where things begin. And this question shows us how messy that beginning can be. Imagine standing in an empty room, nothing around you, no mirrors, no people, no walls, just open space. You turn around, you spin slowly, you try to see what's behind you. But here's the trick. Whatever direction you turn, behind you moves with you. You never really get to be behind yourself. The spot you're chasing always shifts. It's like a shadow you can't touch, always present, but always out of reach. You might say, well, what if I use mirrors? That's just seeing a reflection. It's not actually going behind yourself. What if you record yourself and watch it later? That's watching a version of you from the past. You still didn't go back there in real time. This isn't just about the body, it's about perspective. Your behind only exists because you're facing a direction. It's a concept tied to awareness. You never truly experience the space behind you. You just assume it's there. Let's say you try to cheat this idea. You turn 180 degrees. Now what was behind you is in front. Problem solved? Not really. You didn't go behind yourself. You just turned your front toward what used to be the back. Behind is a moving target. It's not a fixed location you can visit. It follows your orientation like a shadow follows the sun. Even language falls into the trap. Think of how we talk about ourselves. I've got my back, or I'm behind you all the way. These are physical metaphors for support and awareness. But in a literal sense, your back is your blind spot. You can't see it, you don't experience it, you can't defend it in real time. You rely on mirrors, cameras, or other people to know what's going on back there. Now try this. Put your hand on your back. You're touching your own body, right? But are you really behind yourself? Or are you just reaching around from the front? You didn't move your consciousness behind you. You moved a limb back there. You still don't see what's back there. You just feel it. There's a difference between being somewhere and just sending a part of you there. Imagine a robot that follows you around with a camera, always showing what's behind you on a screen in front. You see what's back there in real time. But again, your awareness hasn't moved. You've extended your senses. It's not the same as being back there. It's like standing outside your house and watching the inside through a window. You know what's there, but you're still outside. This gets even weirder when you think about memory. You can remember where you were. You can picture being behind someone else. You can visualize what was behind you yesterday. But those are mental snapshots, not real experiences. You don't go back in time or space, you simulate it. You guess, you recreate. Now picture two clones of yourself in an open field. You stand still. Your clone walks behind you. They're behind you, but are you behind them? No. You can't swap perspectives. You are locked into your body, facing the way you're facing, seeing only forward. Even with someone identical to you, your perspectives will never match. Behind remains behind. Some animals deal with this differently. Think of a chameleon. Its eyes move independently. It can look forward and backward at the same time, but each eye still only sees in one direction. The brain of the chameleon doesn't get to be in both places. It processes two views, but stays in one point of awareness. In martial arts, this idea becomes real. You train to protect your back because it's vulnerable. Why? Because you can't see it. You can't react as fast. If someone's behind you, they have the advantage. You rely on sound, instinct, or teammates to cover that space. It's a blind zone, and it's part of what makes you human. Let's take it further. Virtual reality tries to cheat this idea. Put on a headset with a full 360-degree camera. You turn your head and see everything around you, including what's behind you. But again, the camera is what's actually behind. Your perception is just catching up. You're watching data, not experiencing space from two directions at once. You haven't stood behind yourself. You've just mapped it. Even the way we walk supports this. Our bodies are designed to face forward. Eyes in front, ears to the sides, limbs moving us in one primary direction. You don't naturally walk backward. You can, but it's awkward. You're more vulnerable. You can't see where you're going. Everything about our anatomy is built around not being able to stand behind ourselves. This raises a deeper idea. Where is the self? If your body turns and your mind goes with it, then the self is always oriented toward the front. Your behind isn't part of your awareness unless you specifically try to include it. So the concept of being behind yourself might be impossible not because of physical limits, but because of how consciousness works. There's also an emotional version of this. People talk about looking back at who they used to be, reflecting, being behind their younger self. But in reality, you only move forward. You can revisit old thoughts, regrets, or choices, but you don't actually go back. You can't stand behind who you were. That person doesn't exist anymore. They're a memory. A ghost. You can think about them, but you can't meet them. Try doing this next time you're outside. Spin slowly in a circle. At no point will you ever be looking at your own back. And if someone tries to sneak up on you, they'll always come from behind, never from the front. That's why horror movies use the behind you trick so often. It taps into a primal truth. You are not aware of your own back. You are not able to occupy that space. It's a blind spot for both your body and your mind. This question sounds silly at first. Can you stand behind yourself? But when you really think about it, it starts to unravel how we think about space, identity, direction, and awareness. Behind isn't a place you can go. It's a place you can't escape because it's always with you, always hidden, always out of reach. You know what's funny? The word abbreviation itself is 10 letters long. That's not short. You'd think a word that means to shorten something would actually be short, but instead, it stretches across 4 syllables like it's doing the exact opposite of what it claims. Say it out loud. Abbreviation. It takes time. It rolls off your tongue slowly, ironically, like it's mocking the idea of being brief. And that's what makes it weird. Language usually makes some kind of internal sense. Jump sounds like something sudden. Buzz sounds like what it is. Quick is, well, quick. But abbreviation? It takes up space. Now, think about how we use the word. We say things like etc. as a short form for etc. We call United States of America the USA. Doctor becomes doctor. We make things small to save time, space, or energy. And yet the word we use to describe this process does none of that. It doesn't practice what it preaches. Let's imagine a guy walks into a dictionary meeting. He says, "We need a word that means to make something shorter, maybe something fast and clean." Someone else nods and says, "Yes, let's call it abbreviation." And nobody in that room said, "Wait, isn't that word kind of long?" This isn't just a random linguistic oversight. English has a strange habit of doing this. Consider the word monosyllabic. It literally means a word with 1 syllable. But ironically, monosyllabic has 5 syllables. You'd expect it to be short, sharp, like small, or quick. But instead, it's a mouthful. Same with abbreviation. It tries to represent compactness, but ends up being the exact opposite. The word itself violates its meaning. It's a walking contradiction, or more accurately, a speaking contradiction. Now think about how abbreviations actually help us. When you're writing fast or texting, you don't want to spell out everything. You use OMG, LOL, FAQ, or DIY. All of those abbreviations save you time. And yet to explain them to someone, you still have to say, "That's an abbreviation." You don't say, "That's a BRV," or "That's an R," because there isn't a short form for the very concept of shortening. We don't abbreviate abbreviation. That's the real kicker. And even if you tried to abbreviate it, where do you start? Abrev? That's still 6 letters. It barely shaves anything off. Aber? That's the commonly accepted written form in dictionaries, like when they say N for noun, or aber for abbreviation. But no one says aber out loud. You say the full word. And when you say it, it doesn't feel short at all. We even teach kids about abbreviations in school. And right there on the worksheet, the word abbreviation is at the top, taking up a good chunk of space. 10 letters, 4 syllables. In a lesson about making things small. Imagine explaining this to someone learning English for the first time. You'd say, "This long word means making things shorter." And they'd stare at you like, "Is this a joke?" Nope. That's just how English works sometimes. It bends logic, it throws curveballs, and it doesn't always do what it says. Here's another layer. The Latin root of abbreviation is brevis, which means short. So we took the idea of shortness and built a giant word around it, like putting a skyscraper on top of a tiny house. The intention was good, name the process of cutting things down, but the execution, ironically bloated. It's not the only time English does this. Sesquipedalian is a word that means given to using long words. And guess what? It's a long word. It literally uses itself to prove its point. Same energy as abbreviation. It's also worth pointing out how abbreviations often reflect urgency. In a hospital, you'll see BP for blood pressure, CPR for cardiopulmonary resuscitation. They don't have time to say all that, so they abbreviate. It's about function, survival even. Time matters, words must shrink, and yet the word abbreviation takes its sweet time. When you dig deeper, it makes you wonder, who gets to decide how long a word should be? Language isn't engineered like a machine. It grows in layers, full of contradictions and leftovers. Maybe that's why we have such strange moments like this, where the symbol and its meaning don't match. But the strangeness also opens up curiosity. It makes you look at simple things in a new way. Every time you say abbreviation, a part of you feels that friction. It's subtle, but it's there. You're using a long tool to point at smallness, like picking up a giant pair of scissors to snip a thread. And here's the final twist. We've accepted it. No one really questions the length of the word. We just go with it. It's been like this for so long that it feels normal. But once you notice the irony, it's hard to unsee it. You'll never say abbreviation again without a little smirk or pause. So the next time someone asks what LOL stands for, and you start with, "It's an abbreviation," just know you're using a long word to explain a short one. That in itself is the most human thing about language, trying to make things easier while making them just a little more complicated in the process. Imagine this. You've had the same old broom for years. It's nothing special, just a wooden handle and some stiff bristles. You use it to clean your floor every week. One day, the bristles wear out. You go to the store and replace them. A month later, the handle cracks. You swap that out too. Over time, every single piece of the broom gets replaced. Not a single part from the original broom remains. But here's the twist. You still call it your broom. You still think of it as the same one you've always used. Is it? This question feels simple at first, but it opens up something much deeper. It forces you to think about what makes something what it is. Is it the parts? Is it the history? Is it the name? This is known as a version of the ship of Theseus problem. The ancient thought experiment goes like this. Imagine a famous ship, maybe one that belongs to a hero. Over time, the wooden boards rot and get replaced, one by one, until none of the original wood is left. Is it still the same ship? With the broom, it feels like it should be. After all, you've used it the whole time. You've maintained it. You've even taken care of it. The broom never left your house. You didn't throw it away and buy a new one. You just kept it going, piece by piece. But what if you kept all the old parts, the worn-out bristles, the cracked handle, and someone else came along and reassembled them into a broom? Would that one be your original broom? Now we've got two, one with new parts and a continuous history, and another made of the original materials but with a new history. Which one is the real broom? There's no easy answer here, and that's the point. It shows how we think about identity and change, and how something can feel the same without being the same, at least not in the way we usually define it. Think about your own body. Every cell in your body is replaced over time. Your skin sheds, your bones regenerate, your blood renews itself. You're not made of the exact same material you were 10 years ago, but you still feel like you. So are you? Same with memories. You don't remember every detail of your past, but you believe you're the same person who had those experiences, even if your thoughts, habits, and beliefs have changed. So again, what really stays the same? Some say it's the continuity that matters. The broom didn't disappear. It changed, but slowly. You never stopped using it. There's a straight line from the first use to the last. It doesn't matter that the pieces are new. It's the function and the story that stayed. Others argue that identity needs physical consistency. If none of the original material remains, then it's not the same thing. It might look the same and act the same, but it's technically a new object. It gets trickier when you start applying this to real-world things. Imagine a car you've owned for years. You've replaced the tires, the engine, the seats, even the steering wheel. Is it still your car? Legally, probably yes. Emotionally, definitely. But technically, that depends on what you think gives something its identity. Now bring this into relationships. Let's say someone you knew 10 years ago acted a certain way. They were angry, distant, dishonest. But today, they're calm, present, and honest. Are they still the same person? Some would say yes, they have the same name, the same face, the same past. Others would say no, their behavior is totally different. The parts that mattered have changed. This broom idea isn't just about brooms. It's about us. It's about how we define what things are and who we are when everything keeps changing. There's also a twist in technology. Think about a computer. You buy a desktop. Over the years, you upgrade the graphics card, add memory, switch the motherboard, replace the power supply. Not a single original part is left. Is it still the same computer? And if you built a second machine using only the original parts, maybe stored away in your closet, would that be more authentic? At some point, this stops being a question of parts and becomes a question of meaning. What do you consider the core of something? Is it the stuff it's made of? Is it the timeline? Is it how you feel about it? It's why some people keep using the same username online for years, even if their profile picture, bio, interests, and posts all change. That name becomes their anchor. It carries their identity, even if everything else shifts. In another example, think about a business. A small coffee shop gets sold. The new owner changes the menu, the logo, the chairs, the music. Nothing's left of the original place, but they kept the name. Customers still go there and talk about the old vibe. Is it still the same coffee shop? This Broom paradox touches everything: objects, people, places, even ideas. They all change over time, some slowly, some quickly, and we're left to decide, when does a thing stop being itself? There's no solid line, just a lot of blurry ones, and we're always standing somewhere in that blur, trying to figure out where the real version of something begins and ends. So next time you pick up an old broom, or look in the mirror after a long time, ask yourself, has anything really stayed the same? Or is sameness just something we choose to believe in, to make sense of change? Someone leans over during lunch and says, "Nobody goes to that restaurant, it's always full." At first, it sounds like a normal complaint. You nod, you've probably even said it yourself. But hold on for a second. Try to unpack that sentence slowly. Nobody goes there. That suggests it's unpopular, maybe even dead. Then, it's always full. That means it's packed, crowded. Maybe you even have to wait for a table. So which is it? It's such a simple sentence, yet it trips over itself. It's a contradiction hiding in plain sight. The speaker is saying two things that can't both be true. If nobody goes there, then how is it always full? And if it's always full, then clearly people are going, lots of them. This is what you'd call a casual paradox. It's not wrapped in complex philosophy. It's something you can hear at a dinner table, during a sports debate, or while people talk about traffic or queues. It comes up in real life without anyone noticing the logical trap it holds. And it's powerful because it reveals something about how people think and how they speak without thinking it all the way through. Let's put this into a little scene. You're talking about a popular new cafe downtown. Someone says, "I don't like going there anymore." You ask why. They say, "Nobody goes there now, it's too busy." On the surface, it sounds like they're saying it lost its charm. Maybe it became too trendy. But logically, it's backwards. If nobody is going, it shouldn't be busy. If it's busy, then people are obviously going. The complaint, when you really break it down, contradicts itself. It's the same with certain popular destinations. Imagine someone says the beach isn't worth it anymore. Nobody goes there. The parking lot is always packed. You'd raise an eyebrow at that. If the lot is packed, then people are going. Maybe even too many people. But nobody is just a word we throw in without precision. This paradox isn't really about restaurants. It's about the way people express frustration. In most cases, they're not making a statement about actual numbers. They're speaking emotionally. Nobody goes there doesn't mean zero people. It means I don't know anyone cool who goes there anymore. Or the kind of people I like to be around don't go anymore. Or maybe it's shorthand for, it's changed. I liked it better when it was low key. That's why this contradiction doesn't sound strange when people say it. We fill in the emotional meaning instead of the literal one. But when you isolate the words and hold them up to logic, they start to wobble. The sentence tries to carry two ideas. One, that the place isn't appealing anymore. And two, that too many people are still going. But the way it's worded, it undermines itself. And it's not the only sentence like that. Think about someone saying, "He's so unpredictable, I always know what he's going to do." Or, "She talks too much to be mysterious, but no one really knows her." These kinds of statements twist around themselves. They sound fine at first, until you sit with them a moment. Then the internal conflict shows up. What's interesting is that the brain doesn't catch these contradictions right away. You can speak them out loud and even get nods of agreement. That's because the meaning we infer doesn't come from just the logic of the sentence. It comes from tone, context, mood. You can say something that makes no sense logically and still communicate your feeling perfectly. That's how humans work. Now, bring it back to the restaurant. When someone says, "Nobody goes there, it's always full," what they likely mean is, the wrong kind of people go there now, or the crowd ruined it. It's less about quantity and more about taste, tribe, or personal space. They want to suggest the place is too crowded, but also that it's lost some magic, some exclusivity. This paradox lives in our daily language. It's a signal of something deeper. When we say things like this, we're often talking about belonging, change, or loss. That restaurant was once a secret, Now it's on TikTok. Everyone knows about it. So ironically, the very act of it becoming popular drives away the original fans. They don't want to be part of a crowd. They want to be ahead of it. So they say, nobody goes there anymore. But that's never true. They mean nobody like me goes there anymore. The contradiction sits quietly inside a personal opinion. What makes this one stick in your brain is how it tricks you at first. You think you understand it. It sounds familiar. But then the logic kicks in and throws it back in your face. It reminds you how much of our language is not based on clear, sharp logic, but on impressions, vibes, and shorthand. And it shows up in other places too. Think about music. Someone says, that band sold out. Nobody listens to them now. They're too mainstream. What does that even mean? If they're mainstream, then clearly many people are listening. So again, it's not about numbers. It's about identity, about separation from the crowd. Nobody becomes a placeholder for people I respect. Same with fashion. Nobody wears that anymore. It's everywhere. That sentence practically eats its own tail. If something is everywhere, then people are clearly wearing it. But again, the speaker is drawing a line between everyone and me. You'll notice this paradox more and more once you see it. It hides in casual conversation. It pops up in reviews, online comments, and arguments between friends. And it's not always a bad thing. It's a sign that people are mixing logic and emotion in the same sentence. That's a very human thing to do. But when you slow down and really listen, you'll hear how common it is to say something that collapses in on itself, while still sounding totally normal. So, the next time someone says, nobody goes there, it's always full, don't just hear the words. Hear the paradox. It's not about logic, it's about mood. But your brain will still itch at the contradiction, and that's what makes it stick. You wake up in a white room. There are no walls, no floor, no ceiling, just white. You're floating. There's no sense of up or down, left or right. You try to find your place, but there's nothing to measure it against. You're nowhere. And that's the strange part. If you're nowhere, are you somewhere else too? Let's talk about this question. Can you be in two places at once if you're not anywhere at all? It sounds like something out of a dream or a poem, but let's take it literally. When we talk about being somewhere, what do we really mean? Being in a place usually means your body occupies a physical location. You're in a chair, in a car, in a room. But if none of those things are present, if you are for a moment nowhere, then the rules start to fall apart. And here's where the twist begins. Think about digital presence. If you're on a video call with someone in Tokyo while sitting in your living room in New York, where are you? Physically, you're in New York. But part of you, your face, your voice, your attention, is in Tokyo. Now add in another screen. Maybe you're chatting with someone else in London at the same time. You're splitting your awareness across two continents while never leaving your seat. You're not fully in either place. So are you everywhere or nowhere? Take a moment to consider dreams. You've had a dream before where you're in your childhood home, and then, suddenly, without moving, you're in a completely different place. Maybe a train station, a forest, an empty street. You don't walk there. You don't fly there. You're just there. It doesn't follow logic, but it feels normal when it happens. You wake up and remember it, and something about that transition sticks in your head. How did I get from one place to another without moving? The mind doesn't need roads or footsteps. It just needs a thought. Now think about a coma patient. Someone who is physically alive, lying still in a hospital bed. Let's say their brain is still active in some small way, firing neurons, generating faint dreams, maybe even awareness. To the world, they are in that room. But their experience, if they have one, isn't tied to it. Where are they? If their mind is creating scenes or memories, are they not living elsewhere? Can you say they are in two places at once? Even in more grounded situations, we deal with this. You can be physically present at a meeting and yet completely zoned out, imagining yourself at home or in a different city. People call it not being here, but technically, your body is there. It's your mind that wandered. But if your attention shapes your experience, where are you really? Let's push this further. Suppose there's an astronaut drifting alone in space, with no nearby planets or stations. There's no up or down, no floor beneath them, no horizon. If they open their eyes, they see stars in every direction. Are they in one place or are they nowhere at all? There's no landmark, no room, no edge. The idea of place starts to lose meaning when there's nothing to compare to. In physics, position is always relative. You can't say where something is unless you say where it is in relation to something else. If you're alone in a featureless void, then you're not here or there. You're just suspended. That's the baseline. So if you're not anywhere, could it also mean you're in any of those places? Is that what being in two places at once might actually mean? Not splitting yourself, but existing in a state that's undefined. Quantum physics adds another strange layer. A particle doesn't have a single location until it's observed. It exists in a cloud of possibilities. It might be here or there, or both, until something pins it down. This isn't theory. It's something scientists test and observe. It's called superposition. In that state, the particle has potential locations. But where is it actually? It's kind of not anywhere. Yet that cloud includes everywhere it could be. Let's apply that to people. Imagine yourself at a decision point. You're offered a job in another country. You haven't accepted it yet. You haven't declined either. In your mind, you play out both lives, one where you stay, one where you go. For a while, you live in both futures. You imagine the apartment you'd rent in that new city, the people you'd meet, the kind of meals you'd cook. You're not there, but you're also not here entirely either. Until you decide, your mind exists in both lives. You're not fully in one, not fully in the other. Are you, in a way, in both? There's also memory, when you recall something deeply, like the smell of your old school, or the way sunlight came through your grandmother's window. You're pulled back to that moment. For a second, you don't just remember it. You're in it. Your body's in the present, but your brain is reliving something that no longer exists. It's hard to say you're entirely here when part of you is so immersed in there. All of this brings up a strange idea. Maybe being somewhere is less about space and more about awareness. If you're not aware of your body, your room, your country, if you're detached from all of that, where are you? Are you still here? Can someone be called present if they don't feel present? That's not a metaphor. People in deep meditation, under anesthesia, or in dissociative states all report moments where they lose sense of being anywhere. No body, no time, no place. And yet, something of them still exists. So let's go back to the question. Can you be in two places at once if you're not anywhere at all? It might be that the only way to be in two places at once is to not be tied to a single one. Maybe the moment you leave the idea of place behind, you become part of more than one. A drifting mind, a wandering thought, a particle waiting to land. Maybe that's not poetic, maybe it's just how we work. Let's say someone hands you a product and says, "This is new and improved." You nod, maybe you've heard that phrase 100 times, but then you stop for a second. Wait, how can something be both new and improved? The phrase is common, but the logic underneath it feels strange. Because new implies that something didn't exist before, and improved suggests it did exist, and now it's better. So which one is it? Think of it like this. Imagine you walk into a store and see a sign that says new product. You understand what that means. It's something you haven't seen before. It's fresh, just released. Maybe it's solving a problem in a different way. Now walk into a different aisle and see a sign that says improved product. That's different. That means the thing existed before and the company made some changes. Maybe they changed the design, maybe they fixed a bug, maybe they added a feature, but you know you're looking at version 2 of something. Now put those two words together, new and improved. It's in ads, on boxes, even on food packaging. But when you slow down and really think about it, it kind of collapses. If it's truly new, never seen before, then there's no old version to improve. And if it's improved, then it can't be completely new. It has to come from somewhere. Let's test this with something simple. Imagine a toaster. A company releases a brand new toaster. It's sleek, has one button, never seen before. That's new. Now they take that same toaster a year later and say we've added crumb-catching trays and made it toast 10% faster. That's improved. But would they now call it new and improved? Is that honest? Technically, it's version 2 of something old, so it's improved. But calling it new again feels like a stretch. You see the problem. This isn't just a word game. It's about how language gets twisted over time to sell things or sound more exciting. New and improved sounds better than just improved. It gives the impression that something is brand new and also better than whatever came before. But logically, that doesn't add up. The moment you call something improved, you're admitting that it existed in a different, less good form. You're not starting from scratch. You're editing. There's also a psychological angle here. People like new things. We crave novelty, but we also like reliability. When a product is improved, it tells us it's been tested and updated. Calling something new and improved hits both of those nerves. It promises the excitement of the unknown and the comfort of the familiar. It's a clever trick, and it works because most people don't stop to untangle the contradiction. But when you do pause, the phrase falls apart. Let's go back to the toaster. Imagine it never existed before. The company drew up plans, designed every piece from scratch, and launched it last week. That's new, but is it improved? Compared to what? There's no baseline. You can't improve on something that doesn't exist. Maybe it's better than competitor toasters, but then you're not improving your own product, you're just outperforming someone else's. That's a comparison, not an improvement. Now flip it. Take an old toaster, give it a new paint job, add one small feature. Now it's improved. But is it new? Most of it is the same. The wiring, the form factor, the heating coils, they're all from the original model. So in this case, calling it new feels like a stretch too. You've upgraded it, sure, but you didn't start fresh. You might wonder if this is just nitpicking. Language evolves. Phrases take on meanings beyond their literal definitions. And maybe that's true. But when you look at new and improved, from a logical perspective, it's like saying something is round and square at the same time. It's one of those phrases that we accept because it sounds good, not because it makes sense. There are other examples like this. Take pretty ugly. That's another contradiction we don't think twice about. Or clearly confused, or act naturally. They don't break your brain until you pause and look at the pieces. And then it's hard to unsee. What's interesting is how the phrase new and improved actually reveals more about us than the product it describes. It tells us how much we want both innovation and reassurance. We want the thrill of something we've never seen before, but also the guarantee that it's better than what we had. It's like wanting a surprise party where you know exactly what's going to happen. We want new, but not too new. Improved, but not just a recycled version. This paradox isn't limited to toasters and packaging. You can see it in software too. A company releases a new version of an app and calls it new and improved. But if they've just fixed a few bugs and updated the UI, is it really new? Or is it just a facelift? If the core codebase is the same and the features are mostly the same, calling it new might be more marketing than fact. You can even apply this to people. Think of someone who says they've turned over a new leaf. They're a new person, but they also talk about how they've grown, improved, learned from mistakes. Those two ideas don't always sit well together. If you're truly new, it implies a break from the past. But improvement means continuity, keeping the old and adding to it. You're still you, just better. Not new, just upgraded. So when someone says they're new and improved, whether they're a brand or a person, it's worth pausing. Are they reinventing themselves completely or just polishing the surface? And if they are entirely new, then what exactly got improved? This kind of contradiction lives in the way we talk, the way we sell, and even the way we think. We don't always want strict logic. Sometimes we want something that just feels right. New and improved feels like progress. It feels like change. And that's enough for most people. But once you hear the contradiction, it's hard to unhear it. You start seeing it everywhere. In marketing, in tech, in self-help books, everyone wants to be new and improved. But almost no one stops to ask if those two words even belong together. That's the knot, and it stays with you. Imagine standing in an empty room. There's nothing in your hands, nothing in your pockets, and nothing on the floor. You stretch out your palms and look around, just plain nothing. Now ask yourself, what would it mean to have less than this? Not zero. Less than zero. That idea sounds simple at first, but the more you sit with it, the stranger it gets. Can you hold -1 of a thing? In everyday life, we deal with positive numbers all the time. 1 apple, 2 cars, $10. We even understand zero. If you have 0 apples, you understand that you don't have any apples. The idea is clear. It means the absence of something. But now picture someone asking to borrow an apple from you, and you agree. But you didn't have any apples in the first place. Now you're in apple debt. You owe 1 apple. You don't have it, but you still have to return it. That's -1 apple. Not a real apple in your hand, but a sort of ghost of an apple you're responsible for. That's where negative numbers begin to make sense. Not as physical things, but as representations of obligations or deficits. If your bank account says $50, you don't have a negative pile of money sitting somewhere. You have a promise, an unavoidable need to come up with $50. The concept of less than nothing works because it's tied to relationships between things, not the things themselves. You can owe money, you can be behind in a game, you can have a temperature that's below 0. These are all cases of less than nothing. But here's the strange part. We understand negative numbers because they help us solve problems, but they don't exist in the same way physical objects do. You can't hold negative money in your hands. You can't put negative cookies in a jar. So if someone says, I have 1 less than nothing, they aren't describing something physical. They're describing a situation, a condition that pulls them backward. It's like a hole, not a thing. You can't grab a hole, but you can fall into one. Picture digging a hole in the ground. You remove dirt, you keep digging. The deeper you go, the more you've taken away. The hole gets bigger. What you're left with isn't material, it's space where something used to be. That's what negative numbers really are, measurements of what's missing, how far something is from being neutral or balanced. The hole is real, but it's made of absence. Children learning math often struggle with this. They'll say, how can you have -3 apples? That doesn't make sense. And they're right, you can't physically have negative apples. But if you promised 3 apples to someone and you don't have any, then you are in a position of -3. It's a conceptual placeholder. It tells the story of what should be there, but isn't. Take another example. You're keeping track of scores in a video game. A player gets penalized and their score drops from 0 to -10. That doesn't mean they've lost 10 pieces of anything. It means they've been pushed 10 points below a neutral level. The number is real in the sense that it affects outcomes, strategies, and goals. But it's not something you can count with your fingers. This is where language trips us up. We think of having as possession. If I have $1, I can use it. If I have less than nothing, what am I holding? Nothing. Or the burden of needing to gain something back. It turns out we can have states without holding anything. You can have debt, you can have responsibility, you can have a deficit. These are all real and they impact your life, but they don't sit in your pocket. Mathematically, negative numbers are essential. Try subtracting 8 from 3. Without negative numbers, the answer wouldn't exist. But with them, we get -5 and we can keep moving. Negative numbers let equations stay balanced even when values drop below 0. They help us measure change, direction, and difference. If you walk 3 steps forward, then 5 steps back, you've gone -2 steps from where you started. You've reversed direction. That's more than just a number, it's information about movement, about cause and effect. But outside of math, we start running into weirdness. Think about temperature. 0 degrees Celsius is the freezing point of water. Below that, we enter negative temperatures. The air gets colder, molecules move slower. But again, we're not talking about having cold things. We're talking about less heat, less energy, less molecular motion. Still, nothing you can hold. It's not about cold being a thing. It's about warmth disappearing. And that's why the question sticks with you. What's less than nothing? At first, you think the answer is simple, -1. But then your brain kicks in and says, wait, what does that even mean? You realize you're stepping out of the physical world and into the abstract, into ideas, placeholders, values that guide behavior and consequence, but don't exist in the same way a rock or a shoe does. Even in storytelling, we play with this idea. A character might hit rock bottom, only to discover there's a basement below that, a worse level of worse. That's negative territory. It's emotional, not mathematical, but the logic holds. Less than nothing becomes a metaphor for the point where absence becomes its own kind of presence, where debt, loss, and emptiness start to push back. There's a reason this kind of question resonates. It sneaks up on you. It sounds harmless, even a little silly. But the more you try to answer it, the more it stretches what you think you know about how the world works. It forces you to separate things from the value of things, to ask whether something that doesn't exist can still affect you. And it makes you realize just how much of our reality, money, time, temperature, value, is built on concepts, not just objects. So when someone says, "I have less than nothing," they're not speaking nonsense. They're describing a real condition. It might not be something you can touch or weigh or photograph, but it has force. It moves things. It changes decisions. It creates urgency. And that's what makes it feel real. In the end, having one less than nothing means entering a world where absence isn't neutral. It's active. It pulls, it demands, it marks a shift in state. It's the invisible weight that still changes your balance. It's the shadow of something that used to be there, or something that was never there to begin with. You don't hold it in your hands. It holds you. Let's say you're standing in a wide open field. You look around and you can see in every direction. Now imagine the field gets larger. It stretches, it expands. You don't need to move, but the edges get farther away from you. That's kind of like what the universe is doing. It's getting bigger. Galaxies are moving away from each other. Scientists say space itself is expanding. The distance between things is growing. Not because things are flying through space, but because space is stretching. Now here's the strange part. If the universe is everything, every planet, star, galaxy, and atom, then what is it expanding into? If it's everything, then what's outside it? Shouldn't there be nothing? Or is that nothing actually something? This is where your brain starts to bend a little. When most people hear expanding, they imagine something blowing up like a balloon. That makes sense. A balloon starts small and gets bigger. You can see it take up more space. So naturally, we picture the universe the same way. A balloon floating in a bigger room. The balloon gets larger, so it must be expanding into the room. But the universe isn't a balloon floating in a room. It's the room and the balloon. It's all of it. There is no bigger room. There is no outside. At least not in a way we can understand. Imagine this. You're a character in a 2D video game. You live on the screen. You can move left and right, up and down, but that's it. You have no idea what's behind the screen or around it. From your point of view, the screen is the whole world. Now imagine that screen gets bigger. More of your world appears. More map, more levels. To you, it looks like the world is expanding, but you still don't see what's behind the screen. You don't even know what behind means. That's kind of how we are in our universe. We can see galaxies moving apart. We can measure background radiation and redshifts and other things that show space is growing, but we don't have access to what's outside. And some physicists say there is no outside. The universe might be like the surface of a sphere, finite but without edges. If you go far enough in one direction, you end up back where you started. But even that's hard to picture, because we can't step outside the sphere to look at it. We're stuck on the surface. When we say space is expanding, we mean the fabric of space. Not that stars are flying through empty void, but that the void itself is getting bigger. The metric that defines distances in space is changing. 2 points in space get farther apart over time, even if nothing is moving through space. It's like the grid itself is stretching. Now, if space is stretching, can it stretch into something? That's what feels weird. Our minds want a container. We want to ask, what's it stretching into? But that question might not make sense. It's like asking, what's north of the North Pole? You can walk north from anywhere, but once you get to the North Pole, there's no more north. The direction doesn't exist anymore. In the same way, asking what space expands into might be a category error. You're trying to apply a concept into that only makes sense inside space, not outside it. Some people think maybe the universe is embedded in a higher dimension. Just like a 2D surface exists in 3D space, maybe our 3D universe exists in 4D or 5D space. That could mean there is an outside, but it's beyond what we can observe. There might be other bubbles or brains in this higher space, like separate universes floating in a multiverse. But those are theories. We don't have direct evidence for them. Even if the universe is embedded in a higher dimension, we still hit the same wall. What is that space expanding into? And what's beyond that? You can go on forever asking, what's outside that? And then what's outside that? It becomes an infinite regression. like mirrors facing each other, reflecting forever. Eventually, you have to stop and ask, maybe outside is the wrong way to think about it. Let's switch examples. Think about numbers. There's no biggest number. You can always add one. Infinity is not a number, it's a concept. It doesn't end. In the same way, space might not need a container. It just is. It can grow, change, shift, but it doesn't have to grow into something else. Some models say the universe is infinite already. If that's true, then expansion doesn't mean it's getting bigger. It means the distances between things are growing, but there are still infinite things. Infinity is getting more spread out, not becoming more infinite. But infinity is tricky. You can't measure it like regular things. You can't add to it in a way that changes it. Infinite plus one is still infinite. So in an infinite universe, expansion doesn't mean what we think it means. It doesn't stretch into new territory. It just shifts the rules of distance within itself. Now imagine the universe is not infinite. Let's say it's finite, like a bubble. Then yes, it has a size and it's growing. But still, it might not need an outside. That bubble could be the total of everything. It could curve back on itself in a way that has no edge, no border, no beyond. Just like how the surface of the Earth is finite but has no edge. Here's something to consider. We can't see the whole universe. We can only see what light has had time to reach us. That's called the observable universe. It's about 93 billion light years across. But that's not the whole thing. That's just what we can see. Beyond that, we have no data. The actual universe might be far bigger, or infinite, or curled in on itself. We don't know. So when we ask what the universe is expanding into, we're bumping up against the edges of human understanding. We're trying to use everyday words for something that doesn't behave like everyday stuff. Space, time, dimension. These aren't objects. They're parts of the system we live inside. Trying to step outside and look back is like trying to see your own eyeballs without a mirror. There's also this. Expansion might not be a thing in space. It might be space. The expansion isn't happening inside a thing. The expansion is the thing. It's the growth of the container, not a thing inside the container getting bigger. And yet the instinct stays. We want a wall, a border, something to hit, but there might not be one. Not because it's too far or too hidden, but because it simply doesn't exist. There is no edge to fall off of. There is no cosmic wall we'll eventually hit. In everyday life, when something gets bigger, it takes up more room. So we think of the universe that way. But the universe doesn't follow that rule. It's not taking up more room. It's changing what room even means. So we end up here. The universe is expanding. We can measure it. We know galaxies are moving apart. We know space itself is growing. But what it's expanding into, that's not a question science can fully answer yet. And maybe, just maybe, it's not a question that makes sense to ask at all. Have you ever wondered why we say we're taking a dump when we clearly leave it behind? The phrase doesn't make logical sense if you stop and think about it. You're not taking anything with you. In fact, you're doing the opposite. You're dropping something off. So why do we still say take a dump? Where did that come from? It's one of those everyday expressions we've all used or heard, but almost no one questions. Let's imagine the situation. You feel the urge, you head to the bathroom, you sit down, and, well, you know what happens next. After you finish, you don't scoop it up, put it in a box, and carry it with you. You flush it away. It's left behind. It's literally the definition of leaving something somewhere. So how did we end up with the phrase take in this context? The weird part is that English has a long history of using take when talking about things we do with our bodies. We take a shower, we take a nap, we take a deep breath. In none of those cases are we actually taking something in the literal sense. You don't walk away with the shower. A nap doesn't come with you. You don't carry the breath anywhere. Still, the phrase works. It's familiar. It feels right, even though it's technically inaccurate. This kind of phrasing isn't unique to English. In some languages, they use the equivalent of make instead. In Spanish, for example, you make a poop. That might sound strange in English, but if you think about it, it makes more logical sense. You're producing something. You're making waste. You're not taking it, you're creating it. Yet in English, we went the other direction. We framed it like we're taking something away when we're really not. It gets even weirder when you realize we don't use take in the same way for all bodily functions. You don't say take a pee as often, you go pee. You have to pee. You need to pee. Sometimes people say take a piss, sure, but it's far less common in polite settings. Take a dump, though, has somehow become the go-to phrase. Let's step back and look at what's happening here. We're using a word, take, that usually implies movement, control, or possession. You take an object, you take your time, you take something from someone else. Taking is active, it involves effort, it implies ownership. So why use it for something passive, something you're letting go of, something that leaves your body and stays behind? One theory is that take in these contexts is used to describe the act itself, not the object. When we say take a dump, we're not talking about the thing that's left behind. We're referring to the action, the act of relieving yourself. So it's like saying, take time to go to the bathroom. The dump isn't the object you carry, it's the name of the process. You're taking a moment to do the thing. That explanation makes a little more sense, even if it still sounds weird. Another angle is politeness. Take a dump is crude, but not as crude as the literal alternatives. Saying drop feces or defecate is clinical. Saying poop is childish. Take a dump lives somewhere in the middle. It's blunt, but it's familiar. The euphemism lets us talk about something gross without being too direct. That's how a lot of language works. We use softer words to talk around the truth. This happens a lot in bathroom language. We don't say urinate. We say go to the bathroom, even if there's no bath involved. We don't say defecate. We say take a dump. We hide the act in a phrase that sounds less intense. And over time, those phrases become normal. We stop thinking about their logic. We just say them. The result is a language full of contradictions. You take a dump, but leave it behind. You go to the bathroom, but stay in the same building. You do your business, which has nothing to do with money or deals. None of it makes perfect sense. But that's the strange part. Because we hear these phrases every day, we don't question them. They pass right through our conversations, unnoticed, until someone points them out. Think about it like this. If aliens landed on Earth and you had to explain why humans say take a dump, you wouldn't have a good answer. You'd probably pause and go, huh, yeah, that doesn't make sense. But for us, it's just part of how we talk. It's embedded in the language and nobody feels the need to fix it. This kind of thing shows up in other areas too. We say fall in love like it's an accident. We break news, even though news isn't a physical thing. We catch feelings like they're a virus. Language works through metaphor. That's how it evolves. But sometimes the metaphors get so weird, they stop making any sense at all. That's where this phrase lives, in that blurry space between metaphor and nonsense. Now let's say you're in a conversation and someone casually says they took a dump earlier. You probably wouldn't blink, you wouldn't stop them and say, wait, did you really take it with you? But once you start thinking about it, the phrase unravels. It collapses under its own logic. You didn't take anything. You relieved yourself. You left waste behind. You moved on. Nothing about that involved taking. What's wild is that if we started saying leave a dump, it would sound wrong, even though it's technically accurate. That's how powerful language patterns are. Once we adopt a phrase, it becomes immune to logic. It just feels right, even if it isn't. So we keep saying it, and everyone keeps understanding what we mean, even if the words don't match the action. Language isn't always about truth. It's about habit. It's about shorthand. It's about what people expect to hear. Sometimes it's about making things sound nicer. Other times, it's just inertia. We say things the way we heard them growing up, and we rarely stop to ask why. But the next time you hear someone say they're going to take a dump, your brain might pause for a second. It might notice the contradiction. It might picture them holding it like a briefcase and walking out the door. And for a moment, you'll remember that language is full of little lies we've agreed to believe, just to keep things running smoothly. Imagine two people with the ability to read minds. They're sitting face to face, no words exchanged, just thoughts. One reaches into the other's mind. At that exact moment, the other does the same. So what happens next? At first, this sounds like a fun sci-fi twist, but the moment you think about it more, it starts to bend in strange directions. The mind reader isn't just reading thoughts. They're reading the real-time inner processing of another person. That includes their memories, their thoughts about you, and if you're both reading at the same time, their thoughts about you reading their mind. It becomes a loop. A thought about a thought about a thought, like holding up two mirrors and staring into infinity. This is where it starts to fold in on itself. Let's say you and I can read minds. I reach in and I find that you're currently thinking about what I'm thinking. But what I'm thinking is shaped by what you're thinking, which is based on what you think I might think you're thinking. It's like two systems trying to scan each other's scan in real time. It doesn't settle. It keeps feeding into itself. You don't just get answers, you get recursive thoughts. Thought spirals that refer to themselves endlessly. Picture it like this. You and I are each trying to read a book, but instead of a regular book, each of our books is being written in real time based on what the other person is reading. As soon as I read a sentence in your book, your next sentence is about what I just read. Then I read that, and my next thought changes, which changes your book again. You never reach the end of the chapter. You just chase each other's sentences in circles. Some people compare this to feedback in audio equipment. If you've ever been to a live concert and someone puts the microphone too close to the speaker, you get that loud, rising screech. That's feedback. The sound from the speaker goes back into the mic, loops through the system, and keeps amplifying itself. Mind reading like this would be the mental version of that. You're not just hearing a thought. You're hearing your own echo, distorted through someone else's head. There's also the issue of processing speed. Can the human brain, or any mind-reading brain, handle simultaneous input and output without delay? Probably not. Every time you think a thought, it changes the landscape of what the other person is trying to read. It's like trying to hit a moving target while riding a moving train that's following the same track as your target. Let's pull it into a scenario. Imagine two spies with psychic powers. They're trained to extract secrets with a glance. They're ordered to sit across from each other in a room and read each other's thoughts at the same time. The moment it begins, each spy starts seeing flashes, memories, impressions, names, locations. But those flashes begin reacting to the presence of the other. One spy sees a memory, and the other sees him seeing it. The first sees that he sees that he sees it. Layers form like an onion of awareness, but instead of peeling it, it grows thicker, more tangled. You can't get a clean read. The moment you access their surface thought, it's already changed in response to your presence. The thought you're trying to observe is affected by the act of observing. That's a concept pulled straight out of quantum physics. Observation affects the state. Except this time, it's happening in two minds instead of particles. It's tempting to say it would simply crash, that maybe the brain can't handle this kind of feedback and would shut down or break focus. That might be true. Or maybe you just get noise, like trying to tune into two radio stations at once, each one trying to guess the other's signal and adjust in real time. What you'd hear is static, mixed with fragments of meaning, but never the full message. Now think about the emotional layer. If I read your thoughts, I might see your fears, doubts, judgments. If you read mine at the same time, you'll see my reactions to what I find in you. That includes how I feel about the fact that you're reading me. So you'll see me feel vulnerable, then I'll feel exposed that you saw that, and you'll see that too. It becomes a cycle of self-awareness. Not just, I know that you know, but I know that you know that I know that you know. The loop spirals not just logically, but emotionally. Each layer adds pressure, complexity, confusion. This kind of infinite self-reference exists in logic and mathematics. It's what breaks systems like naive set theory or leads to paradoxes like Gödel's incompleteness. You reach a point where the system cannot fully describe itself without breaking or becoming inconsistent. A mind trying to fully observe itself, or a mirror trying to reflect itself perfectly, runs into a wall. That's what these two mind readers would face. Not just a flood of thoughts, but an unraveling of clarity. It's not about too much information, it's about impossible structure. You're trying to read something that is reacting to being read and doing the same to you. Now add time to this. Thought isn't static, it flows. If you read my mind a second ago, you get something clear. But if you read it now, and I know you're reading it now, then I'm reacting to you reading me now. That changes what you see, which changes how I feel, which changes what you read again. It's like chasing your own shadow, but your shadow moves faster the closer you get. So, can two mind readers really read each other's minds at the same time? Technically, maybe, but what they'd get wouldn't be clean. It wouldn't be like watching a movie or reading a diary. It would be a constant storm of shifting, reacting, morphing awareness, a mental hall of mirrors that never settles. Not because the minds are hiding something, but because the act of reading changes the thing being read. It wouldn't be silence. It wouldn't be clarity. It wouldn't even be noise in the usual sense. It would be like looking at a pool of water that ripples every time you try to see your reflection. The closer you stare, the more the ripples grow. You'd need to find a way to stop thinking just to get a clean read. And by the time you did that, the other mind would already be somewhere else. And what happens if you try to break the loop? If one stops reading and just listens? Maybe then you get a one-sided transfer. But the moment that happens, the symmetry is gone. The magic of the paradox only exists when they act at the same time, when they both try to access the other's unfiltered mind in real time. That's the knot. Two mirrors, two minds, infinite recursion. Not because the minds are complicated, but because self-awareness has no bottom. You can always add one more, I know that you know. You never reach the end. Someone walks up to you and asks, if I ask you if the answer to this question is no, would you say yes? It's a short sentence. The words are simple, but the moment you try to answer it, your brain starts to loop. Let's break it down. They're not asking a regular yes or no question. They're asking if you would say yes to the idea that the answer is no. So, you're being asked how you would respond to a situation that already contains a response. You're being asked to agree or disagree with a possible answer to the very question you're being asked. Let's say you answer yes. That means you would say yes if asked whether the answer to the question is no. But that doesn't work, because if you say yes, you're agreeing that the answer is no, which makes your answer no. But you just said yes. Now try saying no. That means you're saying you would not say yes if asked whether the answer is no. So, you're denying that the answer is no. But denying that the answer is no means the answer must be yes. And if the answer is yes, but you just said no, you're wrong again. You're stuck. There's no way out without contradicting yourself. It's like being asked, will the next word you say be no? And the moment you try to answer truthfully, you're already wrong. If you say no, then you've just said no. So your answer was yes. If you say yes, then the next word you said was not no, so your answer was false again. These questions aren't about tricking you in the way riddles do. They're not meant to be solved. They're built to break down the way we use language and logic. You assume every question has an answer. Most of the time, that's true. But some questions are structured in a way that any answer you give becomes wrong simply because of the structure itself. This particular question, if I ask you if the answer to this question is no, would you say yes? Folds back on itself. It's self-referential. It forces you to consider your answer before you give it, but that answer can only exist by contradicting itself. It's a logic trap where your only choices cancel each other out. You might think it's just a word game, but it points to something deeper. We use language every day without thinking much about how it works. But language isn't perfect. It was created to help people communicate, not to handle situations where the meaning loops back into itself. If you say something like, I'm lying right now, it seems like a simple statement, but it breaks when you try to assign a truth value. If you're telling the truth, then you're lying. If you're lying, then you're telling the truth. That sentence becomes unstable. It can't hold a meaning because the moment it does, it destroys that meaning. This question does the same thing, just in a more casual disguise. It sounds innocent. It's not abstract. There's no philosophy degree required to get into it. Anyone can hear it and feel the twist. But here's where it gets more interesting. Try to imagine answering it in real life. You're sitting at a table with someone. They ask the question. You freeze for a second. Your brain starts working through the parts. You think maybe if you rephrase it, you'll figure out what it's really asking. But rephrasing doesn't help. Every version sends you in circles. Try this one. Are you going to say yes to this question being no? Still hard, still impossible. And the longer you think about it, the more it pulls you in. Not because it's complex, but because it challenges the way you normally think. In everyday life, we're used to clear answers. Red means stop, green means go. Questions have answers. Choices have outcomes. But then you hit something like this, and you realize there are cracks in that system. There are moments where language becomes a mirror reflecting itself, endlessly. These kinds of questions also reveal something about how your brain handles information. Most of the time, when you process a question, you treat it as having a structure. Something like, if A, then B. You try to break it down. But with self-referential questions, that system doesn't work. You can't isolate the pieces, because each piece is referring to another piece that depends on it. It's like trying to build a tower where every block needs the one above it to be in place first. This is why computer programming, logic design, and formal philosophy all have to create rules to avoid situations like this. You can't write clean code if your conditions refer to themselves in unstable ways. The system crashes. The logic fails. The same thing happens here, just in your brain. Now take a step back. Why do questions like this bother us? It's not just because they're confusing. It's because they should make sense. On the surface, there's no big word, no tricky math. But the moment you try to engage, you get stuck. That discomfort you feel, that mental itch, is your brain realizing it's stepped into a loop it can't exit. It's like trying to walk through a door that's actually a painting of a door. You keep reaching, but nothing opens. Now imagine someone used this trick in conversation. Not as a joke, but seriously. They ask you that question and expect an answer. What do you say? You can't say yes. You can't say no. Saying I don't know is safe, but it's a dodge. So maybe the only true answer is to stay silent. But even that is a choice, and now you've just made a decision without saying anything. Does that count as an answer? You can see how deep it goes. And yet, it all started from a sentence that seems so simple you might have scrolled past it on a meme page. That's what makes it powerful. Not because it has an answer, but because it shows you what happens when language turns on itself, and when logic can't save you. Drawing a perfect circle on a piece of paper. Smooth, round, no corners, no sides. It's as clean as geometry gets. But now let's ask a question that doesn't sound that deep at first. Can a circle be edgy? At first glance, this question feels like a joke. A pun, maybe. You think, of course not. A circle literally has no edges. That's the whole point of a circle. And you'd be right, mathematically speaking. A circle is defined as a shape where every point on the edge is equidistant from the center. It's smooth, continuous, with no angles and no sides. So where does the edge come in? Let's pause here and shift focus a bit. Imagine a person. Let's say they wear dark clothes, say dramatic things, and act in a way that gets attention. You might call them edgy. That word doesn't mean they have sharp corners, right? It means they're doing something different, something that pushes a boundary, even if you don't know what boundary it is. That kind of edgy has nothing to do with geometry and everything to do with perception. So when we ask if a circle can be edgy, maybe we're not asking about shape anymore. Maybe we're asking about behavior, context, or even identity. Let's bring it back to geometry, just for clarity. Think of a square, 4 straight lines, 4 clear edges. When you hold a square, you know where it starts and stops. You can feel the corners. A triangle has corners. A hexagon has 6. The edge of a shape gives it definition. It tells you where one side stops and another begins. But a circle doesn't have those. There's no shift, no turn, just constant curve. You run your finger around it, and you'll never find a sharp change in direction. That's what makes it a circle. But what happens when we think about edges not as physical corners, but as moments of transition? A circle doesn't have an obvious edge, but it does have a boundary. The outside of the circle is not the inside. Something is dividing the two, even if it doesn't feel like a corner. That boundary, smooth as it may be, is still a line that separates what's in and what's out. We might not call that an edge in casual conversation, but it performs the function of one. It draws a line between 2 zones. And in that way, maybe the circle isn't as smooth as we thought. Let's take a scenario. Imagine a massive crowd standing in a field. You're standing in the middle, holding a rope and walking in a wide arc until you return to your starting point. Now you've made a circle on the ground. You're inside it, and the crowd is outside it. You haven't built a wall. You haven't put up any signs. But people get it. That rope makes a boundary. That circle you drew, made of nothing but open space, now has meaning. People respect that shape. They don't step inside unless invited. So even without physical edges, the circle holds power. It tells you where you are and where you're not supposed to be. That's a kind of edge too, a psychological one. Still, you could argue that this isn't edgy. It's subtle, it's passive, it's soft. But let's flip the circle's role. Take it from the paper and drop it into culture. Think about logos. Many companies use circles in their branding. Think of the Olympic rings. Think of the Pepsi logo. Think of the Target symbol. Circles look clean, safe, balanced. But now imagine a circle used against that expectation. Think of an artist drawing a blood-red circle around a politician's face on a poster, or a protest group spray painting circles around surveillance cameras to mark them out. In those cases, the circle doesn't feel peaceful. It feels aggressive, subversive. It challenges the norm. Suddenly, that soft shape isn't so soft anymore. It's drawing attention. It's marking territory. It's saying, this matters, or this is dangerous, or this is wrong. That's edgy behavior, and it comes from a circle. Let's get more abstract. Take social media. You ever notice how profile pictures are often shown in circles now? Instagram, LinkedIn, even your phone contacts. The circle cuts the corners off your photo. It rounds out your face, makes everything look a little more pleasing, a little more polished. But what if you want your profile to stand out? You use color, you use animation, you add contrast, and still, the shape holds you in. You're stuck inside the circle. That limitation, ironically, becomes the reason people get creative. They use the very constraint of the shape to push boundaries. The edge becomes the reason the edge gets challenged. Now consider this. What if the real edge of a circle isn't in its geometry, but in how it's used? Think about movement. A wheel is a circle. Put it under a car and it goes. The circle becomes a tool for change. A round object rolls. It doesn't sit still, it doesn't anchor. It's motion incarnate. A square can hold you in place, but a circle takes you somewhere. That's not how we usually think of being edgy, but maybe that's the most radical part of all. Instead of drawing lines, it rolls past them. You can also think of circles in logic or arguments. Circular reasoning is usually considered a flaw. When someone says, "I'm right because I said I'm right," we call that circular. It has no foundation, no beginning, no end. It just loops. And yet, that kind of logic can feel powerful, almost unbreakable. It deflects criticism by constantly referring back to itself. In some circles, pun intended, that's a power move. Not rational, but undeniably bold, maybe even edgy. And that brings us to a deeper point. The word edgy itself has two meanings. There's the literal meaning, something with a sharp edge, a knife, a corner. And then there's the cultural one, something that breaks the rules, that stands out, that makes you uncomfortable. In this second sense, maybe the circle has always been edgy. It just hides it well. A perfect circle is unnatural. You won't find many in nature. Sure, you get approximations, bubbles, planets, ripples on a pond, but a mathematically perfect circle, that's an idea, a concept, something humans invented. That makes it weird by default. It doesn't fit the chaos of the real world, and anything that doesn't quite fit might just be pushing the edge in its own quiet way. So, can a circle be edgy? Not by geometry, not by angles or sides, but in how it's used, how it behaves, and how it's perceived. Maybe it's more edgy than we think. You check your surroundings. Everything feels calm, nothing out of the ordinary. And yet, there's this voice in your head that says, be ready, something's going to happen. You brace yourself. You expect something unexpected, but here's the problem. The moment you expect the unexpected, it becomes expected. You've prepared for it, anticipated it. You've told your mind, whatever weird thing shows up, I saw it coming. So if you're ready for it, does it still count as unexpected? That's where the twist begins. This question sounds like a little word game, but it actually pokes at how we deal with uncertainty, preparation, and the illusion of control. It feels like you're building a shield, getting smarter, more aware, more cautious. But what if that shield folds in on itself? Think about walking into a dark room. You've been told something strange might happen. You're ready for a ghost to jump out. You're on edge. You hear every sound. You see every shadow. You expect the unexpected. But then, nothing happens. And because you were prepared, you weren't caught off guard. So did anything truly count as unexpected? Or maybe something did happen, but it didn't scare you because you were expecting it. It's a mental trap. You're looping. This idea messes with your definition of surprise. For something to surprise you, it has to go against your expectations. But the moment you make being surprised the plan, you've canceled it out. Now, imagine a teacher tells you there's going to be a surprise test next week. You ask, which day? They say, I'm not telling you. You think, okay, maybe it's Monday. But Monday comes and there's no test. So now you think, then it has to be Tuesday. But Tuesday passes too. By Friday, you're sure it must be that day. And since you expect it, it can't be a surprise anymore. But what if the teacher gives the test on Wednesday, the day you thought least likely? Were you surprised? This is similar to something called the unexpected hanging paradox. A judge tells a prisoner, you'll be hanged next week, but it will be a surprise. The prisoner thinks it through and concludes the hanging can't happen because he'll always be able to predict it. But when the guards show up on a random day, he's still surprised. So what happened there? Expectation played tricks on itself. The prisoner thought he had outsmarted the system by logically ruling out all possibilities. But the twist was that his logic couldn't stop reality. The surprise came not from randomness, but from his overconfidence. Let's go back to your life. You walk down a quiet street late at night. You tell yourself, something might happen. Someone might jump out. You've trained yourself to be alert, but maybe nothing happens. Maybe that hyper-awareness turns out to be unnecessary. Still, you feel safer, more in control. That's where this paradox has a grip, because it makes us ask, does being prepared actually prevent surprise? Or does it just disguise it? Think about a horror movie. The ones that get to you the most aren't the ones with jump scares every 5 seconds. It's the ones where you know something's coming, but not when or how. You're expecting it. You know it's going to get you. And then it doesn't. And then it does when you've almost let your guard down. In that moment, was it expected or unexpected? That line gets blurry, because now we're not just dealing with logic, we're dealing with emotion, tension, timing. Let's twist it again. Say you tell your friend, be ready, I'll text you something weird tomorrow. Your friend waits, all day, nothing. The next day you send a message that just says, it's already begun. That message lands not because of what it says, but because of the timing. You made them expect something then, and then dropped it later. The surprise wasn't about what, it was about when. So now, the question shifts. Maybe expecting the unexpected doesn't cancel surprise, but only changes its shape. You've raised a shield, but the world isn't trying to hit you the way you imagined. It goes around the shield, it finds a side door, and still, you're surprised. There's a deeper part to this. We live in a time where people try to control uncertainty. We prepare for disasters, we predict markets, we track patterns, we try to make sure nothing catches us off guard. But the irony is, the more we try to be ready for everything, the more we create blind spots. It's not just a mental loop anymore. It becomes a strategy that defeats itself. If you're always looking for a threat, what happens when kindness appears? Do you miss it? If you expect betrayal, do you treat people in ways that push them away? This paradox isn't just a word trick. It's a way of looking at how your brain handles risk, trust, time, and control. Even in relationships, it shows up. You expect someone to hurt you because that's what people have done before. So you keep your walls up. You're ready. But in doing that, you don't let anyone close enough to prove you wrong. That expectation of the unexpected becomes a kind of self-fulfilling loop. You were trying to avoid the hurt, but you also avoided the good. So what does expect the unexpected actually mean? At first it sounds wise. Be adaptable. Stay sharp. Think ahead. But taken too far, it collapses in on itself. You can't truly live in the moment if you're constantly scanning for surprise. You can't fully relax if you're always waiting for the twist. Let's say you're walking through a haunted house attraction. You know things will jump out. You're bracing for it. But still, when the guy in the clown mask jumps out from behind the curtain, your body reacts. Your brain knew it was coming. Your heart didn't. That's another layer. You might expect the unexpected with your thoughts, But your body, your gut, your instincts, they still feel surprise. They don't run the same script as your logic. So maybe that's the answer hiding in the question. Maybe expecting the unexpected is something your mind tries to do, but your nervous system laughs at. Maybe it's not about avoiding surprise, but being ready to respond to it. And maybe that's the deeper twist. Because expecting the unexpected doesn't stop weird things from happening. It just changes how you meet them. And sometimes, the biggest surprise is realizing you were never really ready for any of it. You just thought you were. Imagine this. You're sitting in a classroom. The teacher asks a question. You don't know the answer, but something happens in your head. You know that you don't know. There's a kind of certainty in your uncertainty. You don't have the information, but you're aware that the information is missing, and that awareness feels like knowledge. But is it? This sounds like a word game, a clever twist, but it goes deeper. It touches something real about how we think, how we learn, and how we build our sense of truth. Let's say you're asked, what's the capital of Kazakhstan? Maybe you hesitate. You feel a gap in your memory. You recognize that gap. You think, I don't know this. That feeling, that mental ping, isn't nothing. It's a kind of meta-awareness. You're not in total darkness. You're standing near a light switch, even if the bulb isn't on. And that's the strange part. If you know that you don't know, do you really not know? Think about someone who truly doesn't know they don't know. A person who hears something false and believes it with full confidence. They're not aware of their ignorance. They act on it. They repeat it. To them, there's nothing missing. That's not just lack of knowledge, that's blind ignorance. Now compare that with someone who says, I'm not sure, I don't think I have enough information. That person is different. They're tuned into their own limits. That's a kind of clarity. It's knowledge about your own mind, not the world outside it, but it's still knowledge. So what is knowing you don't know? In philosophy, this touches something called metacognition. It means thinking about your own thinking. You don't need to know the answer to know that you lack the answer. The brain creates a signal, a feeling of doubt or hesitation. And in that moment, you're not just empty, you're observant. This might sound small, but it plays a big role in learning. The best learners aren't the ones who always know the right answers. They're the ones who can detect when something doesn't add up. They can sense gaps. They know when to ask questions. That's what keeps learning alive. But there's still a strange knot in this idea. If someone tells you, I know that I don't know, aren't they still claiming knowledge? Doesn't that make the whole statement flip? Let's build a scenario. You walk into a room with a big black box in the middle. You're told something is inside, but no one tells you what. You say, I don't know what's inside the box. That's fair. But if you say, I know I don't know what's inside the box, it feels different. You're not just expressing confusion, you're making a statement about your mental state. You're pointing to your own limits and saying, that's where I am. That's not the same as saying, I know what's in the box. But it's not pure ignorance either. Now think of someone who says, I don't know what I don't know. That's even trickier. That's someone who can't even see the box. They're in a fog. They don't sense the missing piece, and so they can't even start looking. That's true unawareness. So let's go back. You know that you don't know something. You're aware of a gap. You're naming it. You're defining its shape, even if you don't know what fills it. That kind of thinking is rare. It's honest. And it leads to real questions. It's also a kind of defense. When you know that you don't know, you're less likely to bluff. You don't make stuff up. You don't pretend. You pause. You ask. That changes everything. In real life, this shows up everywhere. You're in a conversation. Someone brings up a topic you haven't studied, say cryptocurrency. You might say, I don't know much about that. But if you go one step further and say, I don't know much about that, you're taking ownership. You're clearing space in your brain. You're not just blank, you're receptive. That matters in arguments, in learning, in leadership. Now picture the opposite. Someone who never admits they don't know. They have answers for everything. Quick comebacks, strong opinions, but underneath, they've never asked themselves if they might be wrong. They've never paused. That's dangerous, because it feels like strength, but it's a house on sand. So here's the paradox again. If you know that you don't know something, You're not as ignorant as you seem. You're standing on a bridge between not knowing and knowing. You're aware. You're real. That matters more than having answers. Socrates, the Greek philosopher, was famous for saying, "I know that I know nothing." It sounds like a riddle, but he meant it. He was pointing to the value of intellectual humility, of curiosity, of openness. He wasn't claiming to be wise because he had knowledge. He was wise because he knew what he didn't know. And here's another twist. When you admit that you don't know, people listen more. They trust you. Why? Because you're not pretending. You're not spinning. You're honest. That kind of clarity cuts through noise. It works in science too. A scientist doesn't say, "We know everything." They say, "We know this much and we're still learning." That's the heart of progress. The unknown isn't a problem, it's a path. So now let's flip the question one more time. Is it possible to not know that you know something? Surprisingly, yes. Sometimes we learn things so deeply that we forget we learned them. We call them tacit knowledge. You might know how to ride a bike, but struggle to explain how. You might solve problems without realizing the steps you're using. In those moments, you know, but you don't know that you know. The human mind is weird like that. It stores things, hides things, reveals them in strange ways. So we have a kind of spectrum. At one end, not knowing and not knowing that you don't know. Blind ignorance. Then not knowing, but knowing that you don't know. Intellectual honesty. Then knowing, but not knowing you know. Intuition. And finally, knowing and knowing that you know. Mastery. So where are you right now? Are you hearing this and thinking, "That's true, I've felt that before"? If so, then you're probably somewhere in the middle of that spectrum, and that's a good place to be. It means your mind is open, but active. Quiet, but alert. The most dangerous people are the ones who always think they know. The most trustworthy ones are the ones who are clear about what they don't. And if you're sitting there thinking, "I don't know much, but I know I don't," then maybe you're closer to wisdom than you thought. Knowing you don't know isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It's the beginning of curiosity, the start of real learning. And it's one of the simplest, strangest truths your mind can hold. You're sitting in a room, a person walks in and places a box on the table. You ask, "What's inside?" They shrug and say, "I don't know." You nod, simple enough. But then they pause and say, "Actually, I know I don't know." That's where the loop begins. Think about that line. I know I don't know. It sounds logical. It sounds like awareness. But it creates a problem. Because once you say that you know something, even if what you know is that you don't know something, you're still claiming knowledge. You're making a positive claim. So, is it knowing or not knowing? Let's slow that down. Say you're in a trivia game. The host asks a question about ancient Greek pottery. You've never studied that. You've never heard the term they used. You think, "I have no clue." That's fair. You recognize the gap. You've just identified something you don't know. But if you can recognize it, doesn't that suggest you know something about it? Maybe not the details, but at least that it exists. You know the category. You know your own limits. So maybe knowing that you don't know is still a kind of knowledge, like standing at the edge of a forest you've never walked through. You don't know what's inside, but you see the trees. You know the forest is there. That counts for something. But what about things you don't even know exist? Imagine someone hands you a blank envelope and says, "Inside is a word in a language you've never heard of." You've never studied that language. You can't even guess the alphabet. Do you still know that you don't know what the word means? Yes, but only because they told you there's something to be known. They gave you a hook, a reason to think there's knowledge to be missed. Without that, how could you even recognize the gap? That's the real issue. To know that you don't know something, you first need to have some tiny signal that there is something. If there's no signal, if you don't even suspect that knowledge exists, then you can't say you don't know it, because you're not even aware there's a gap. This is what makes the question interesting. It isn't just about not knowing, it's about the meta level, knowing about your own ignorance, and that gets philosophical very fast. There's a famous example from the world of ancient philosophy. Socrates, the Greek thinker, was told by the oracle at Delphi that he was the wisest man alive. Socrates was confused. He said, "I know nothing." But then he realized that was the reason. Everyone else thought they knew everything. He at least knew that he didn't know. That made him wise. It wasn't that he had more answers. It was that he recognized the limits of his understanding. He had what you could call epistemic humility, the ability to step back and say, I might be wrong. That mindset is rare. Most people double down. They pretend to know more than they do. They avoid the feeling of uncertainty. But knowing that you don't know is powerful. It keeps you open. It stops you from being trapped by fake certainty. Still, it doesn't fully solve the paradox. Here's another way to twist it. Let's say there are two categories of knowledge. The things you know, like your name, your birthday, your favorite food. That's basic. Then the things you don't know, like quantum physics or how to fly a helicopter, assuming you don't already. But what about a third category? The things you don't know. The blind spots, the gaps you haven't even identified. How do you relate to those? How do you explore what you're unaware of? That's the strange part. You can only know that you don't know something if you already have a shadow of that knowledge, like a missing puzzle piece. You know something's missing because the space is empty, but if you've never even seen the puzzle, you won't know there's anything missing at all. Now imagine you're trying to explain this to a child. You point to the stars and say, there are galaxies we haven't seen yet. They ask, how do you know? You answer, because our tools have limits. That's the same idea. We know there's more, but we can't access it yet, so we admit we don't know. But even that admission depends on some clue, some evidence, even if indirect. The idea of knowing that you don't know only works when there's some kind of outline, a shape around the missing piece. Otherwise, it's not just unknown, it's invisible. Here's where it gets even stranger. Imagine a future version of you, 20 years from now, looking back at who you are today. That version knows things you don't yet understand. They've learned from life, they've made mistakes, they've seen more of the world. That version of you would probably say, I didn't know what I didn't know back then. So now you ask, do you currently know what you don't know? Some things, yes. You can list skills you haven't learned, places you haven't visited, but most of the important stuff, the things that will shift how you think, you can't name those yet. They live outside your current view. You don't know them, and you don't even know of them. That's the third layer. And that's what makes the original question so haunting, because it suggests that most of your ignorance is invisible. You live in it, you breathe it in, you make choices based on what you think you know. But most of the world, most of the knowledge, lies outside that circle, and you can only stretch the edge of that circle slowly, with effort, curiosity, and luck. This is why people say wisdom starts with admitting ignorance. Not just the stuff you can list, but the gaps you can't see. So yes, in many cases, you can know that you don't know something. That kind of awareness is valuable. But the deeper truth is that you're always surrounded by a fog of unawareness. Some of it is thick, some of it is subtle. And you won't even realize how much you've missed until you step out of it. Which raises the final question. How do you find the edges of what you don't know? That's not something you answer. It's something you chase. Imagine you build a time machine. It's real, it works, and you're about to use it for one purpose, to stop yourself from ever building it. You punch in the coordinates, you travel back a few months, walk into your old garage, and find your past self working on the prototype. You explain everything. You warn them about the danger, the regret, the ripple effects you've seen. You say, don't build it. It's not worth it. Your past self listens. They believe you. They never finish the machine. But here's where the knot tightens. If they never finished the machine, then you never built it. If you never built it, you never went back in time. If you never went back, then you didn't stop yourself. And if you didn't stop yourself, then you did build the machine. So now you did go back in time. But if you went back, then you stopped yourself, which means you didn't build it, which means you couldn't go back. That's the loop. The action you take undoes the conditions that allowed you to take the action. The cause cancels the effect, and the effect cancels the cause. It's like a light switch that turns itself off when it's on and on when it's off. No matter how many times you flip it, you never land on a stable state. In physics and logic, this is known as a temporal paradox. But you don't need a lab or equations to feel how strange it is. All you need is this thought experiment. Let's make it clearer. Imagine you're walking into your house and you see a note on the table. It's in your handwriting. It says, "Don't go into the basement." You have no memory of writing it. You didn't leave the note, but there it is. You go down to the basement anyway, and you find a version of yourself who's just built a time machine and used it to send that note back 5 minutes earlier. That version of you begs you not to continue. So you agree. You destroy the machine. You never build it. 5 minutes later, when you walk into the house again, there's no note, because you never sent one. But if the note isn't there, what stopped you from going into the basement the first time? Nothing. So you go down there again. The loop begins again. Every time you break it, it resets. Every time you fix it, it breaks. There's no final outcome. These types of thought experiments raise a question. Is it even possible to change the past? Some theories in physics suggest that time may be like a fixed line. You can travel along it, maybe even loop around it, but you can't alter it. You can be part of it, but not outside it. This would mean that anything you do in the past already happened and was always going to happen. So if you travel back to stop yourself, maybe you never succeed. Maybe your past self misinterprets the warning. Maybe something interrupts you. Maybe it was always fated to fail. That's called the Novikov self-consistency principle. It says the universe won't allow contradictions. If you try to create one, the timeline bends in ways that prevent it. But let's say that's wrong. Let's say the universe allows you to stop yourself. You manage to change the past. Now you face a bigger issue. You've split the timeline. You've created a fork in reality, one where you built the machine and one where you didn't. You now exist in a branch that shouldn't include you. You are the paradox. Here's an analogy. You're writing a book. Halfway through, a character climbs out of the story and erases the first few chapters. Now you, as the writer, are stuck with a book that starts in the middle, with a character who shouldn't exist yet. The story doesn't make sense anymore. And the character? They're part of a version of events that has now been deleted. That's you. You're the character who just erased your own backstory. So what happens to you? Some theories say you disappear. You fade out of existence, like a file that's been deleted because its folder was never created. Others suggest you stay, but you're cut off from your origin. You're now a floating point in space-time, detached from any cause, a ghost of a decision that undid itself. Still others propose that every action spawns a new timeline. In this view, when you stop yourself, you create a new branch where the machine was never built. But your original branch still exists. It hasn't gone anywhere. You just can't return to it. This is called the multiverse theory. It solves the paradox by saying, fine, you changed the past, but not your past. You made a new one. The knot doesn't untie, it splits. But even that raises problems. If you're in a new timeline, what happens to the version of you that belongs there? Are you replacing them? Are you living their life? Is that ethical? Is it even survivable? And what happens to memories? If you stop yourself from building the machine, and your new self never experiences time travel, do they remember the old timeline? Do you remember it? That brings up the idea of memory loops. Maybe the only thing that remains after you break the timeline is the memory of breaking it. Like déjà vu, like a gut feeling you can't explain. Maybe you forget the machine, but you keep the fear. You never build it, but you're scared of something you can't name. In real life, of course, we don't have time machines, but we make choices that feel like this all the time. You decide not to do something, and years later, you wonder what would have happened. You imagine another version of you, one who did it, one who moved, one who said yes. And in a way, that version of you exists only as a paradox, a self that created a choice that erased itself. That's what makes this thought experiment stick. It's not just about time machines, it's about regret, about trying to undo what's already done, about choices that cancel themselves out. So when you ask, what happens if I travel back and stop myself from time traveling? You're really asking something deeper. Can I undo the path I took without undoing the version of me that took it? The logic says no. The story says maybe. And your brain says, don't think too hard about it, or you'll end up in a loop of your own. Imagine this. You're in a spelling test, and the teacher asks you to spell the word wrong. You think for a second and write down, W-R-O-N-G. That's correct. But let's say the question wasn't, how do you spell the word wrong? What if the actual task was to spell a word incorrectly? In that case, spelling wrong, the actual word, would technically be the right answer and the wrong one, all at once. See where this is going? This isn't a grammar puzzle. It's a logic twist hiding in plain sight. The confusion begins with language and how it folds back on itself. The word wrong has two jobs here. One is its usual job, the opposite of right. The other is its physical form as a word made of letters. So when you're asked to spell a word wrong, there's ambiguity. Are you being asked to make a spelling mistake? Or are you being asked to write the word wrong? If someone told you spell a word incorrectly, most people would pick a random word like apple and write apple or apple. That feels wrong. You get the point. You intentionally misspell something to match the instruction. But here's where the mind folds. If instead you spell the word wrong, as in W-R-O-N-ging, haven't you also followed the instruction? You've spelled a word, and it happens to be wrong. It just doesn't happen to be incorrect. So now we hit a wall. You followed the instruction perfectly, but not in the way it was intended. This is where logic and language stop shaking hands. Let's go deeper. Imagine someone gives you a written instruction. Please spell a word incorrectly. You think, all right, I'll spell incorrectly as incorrectly. Job done. But then someone else takes the same instruction and spells the actual word incorrectly, and they spell it incorrectly. They didn't make a mistake, they just spelled the word incorrectly. Which one of you followed the instruction? Both? Neither. This is what makes this tiny language trick so satisfying. It exposes the weird gap between meaning and interpretation. Our brains are built to assume context, so when someone says spell a word incorrectly, we think they want us to fail on purpose. But language isn't just about meaning, it's about structure, about syntax. And if you follow the structure strictly, if you spell the word incorrectly, then you've technically done what they said. Here's another way to think about it. Imagine a kid is told, draw a square badly. One kid draws a wobbly, lopsided square. Another draws a perfect square and writes the word badly inside it. Which one followed the instruction? In terms of intention, the first one did. But in terms of language, the second one can argue that they literally did what was asked. Same idea with spelling wrong. We bump into this in real life too, not just riddles or jokes. Take legal language. Legal instructions often have to be extremely specific. If a contract says you must report a violation in writing, does an email count? What if you use a messaging app? The instruction might say one thing, but interpretation opens a whole new door. Words mean different things depending on whether you're thinking literally, functionally, or culturally. That's what makes this spell the word wrong idea so clever. It lives in the thin space between literal action and intended meaning. It shows how we process language, not by logic alone, but by assumption. We think they must mean to make a spelling error. But what if they don't? Think about classroom scenarios again. A teacher writes, spell a word wrong. One student writes, banana for banana. Another student writes, wrong. What grade should each one get? If you were the teacher, would you mark both correct, or both wrong, or only one right? This is why this idea works so well in jokes and riddles. It creates confusion with absolute clarity. There's no trick, no deep grammar rule, no weird logic math. It's just playing with meaning. You do exactly what's asked, and end up with an answer that's both true and false, depending on how you read it. And this also points to a broader idea, the power of framing. Say someone gives you a direction, paint a blue wall. If you think they mean paint a wall blue, then you're going to change the color of a wall. But if the wall is already blue, maybe they mean to paint on the blue wall, as a canvas. Same instruction, different frame. Spell a word wrong is the same kind of sentence. What you think they mean changes everything. Here's one more angle. Computers, for example, do exactly what they're told. No assumptions, no context. If you gave this instruction to a computer program, spell a word incorrectly, it would probably return an error, because the instruction isn't specific enough. That tells us something too. Human beings rely heavily on intended meaning, tone, and context clues. Machines do not. So this silly little word game, it exposes a truth about how our minds process instructions. We think we're logical creatures, But we often prioritize what makes sense over what's literally there, which is why spelling the word wrong when asked to spell a word wrong is somehow right. It's clever because it's plain. It's deep because it's short. And it loops because it never really resolves. The next time someone tells you to do something wrong, maybe don't assume they want a mistake. Maybe they want a clever answer. Maybe wrong isn't always wrong. You press your fingers together, you grip a pencil, you tap the surface of your phone, you feel pressure, you feel resistance. It feels like touching. But what if I told you, in a very real and measurable way, you've never touched anything in your entire life? When we say we touch something, what do we mean? Usually it means that two objects come into contact. Skin on glass, hand on table. But if you zoom in far, far closer than you can see, something strange happens. At the atomic level, things don't behave like they do in our everyday world. Atoms are mostly empty space, a nucleus in the middle. Electrons orbiting it. That's your basic atom. If the nucleus were the size of a grain of rice, the nearest electron would be hundreds of feet away. In between, nothing, just vacuum. The solid desk in front of you, 99% of it is empty. Same goes for your fingers. So why doesn't your hand pass through the desk? It comes down to forces, specifically the electromagnetic force. Every electron carries a negative charge. Negative charges repel other negative charges. When you bring your hand close to a surface, the electrons in your hand push against the electrons in the object. That's what you're feeling. Not your atoms merging. Not contact. Just resistance. Force fields pushing back against each other. Imagine two magnets facing each other with the same poles. You try to push them together, but they resist. The closer you get, the harder it is. You never feel the moment they touch. That's what's happening between you and everything around you. The sensation of touch is your nerves interpreting this repulsion. Nerve endings in your skin detect pressure, temperature, texture. But those are effects of electromagnetic interactions. Your brain translates the resistance into a feeling. You touch a rock and feel its roughness. You feel the cold, but you aren't really making contact. The atoms are just repelling yours. Nothing ever touches. This raises a weird point. If you never touch anything, then every interaction you've ever had is a kind of illusion. Not fake, but filtered. Your senses experience consequences, not contact. Let's go further. You sit in a chair. You feel the support. But again, it's the same thing. The atoms in your body are being pushed up by the atoms in the chair. Gravity pulls you down, but the chair pushes back. That upward force, called the normal force, is just electromagnetic repulsion. The chair and your body are locked in a standoff of charges. That pressure you feel, it's that invisible war. Now take walking. Your foot presses down on the floor. The floor pushes back with equal force. Newton's third law. You lift off and move. But it's all done through fields, not contact. Just reaction. Let's flip this. What would actual touching look like? If atoms could truly come into contact, if electrons didn't repel each other, your hand would pass right into the surface. Not like a ghost, but like one object blending into another. You'd merge at the molecular level. Your atoms could move into and around the atoms of another object. That's not touch anymore, that's fusion. And it would be dangerous, extremely dangerous, because the only way atoms truly touch is in a nuclear reaction. In the sun, hydrogen atoms slam into each other with such force that they overcome their repulsion. Their nuclei merge. That's fusion. It releases huge amounts of energy. If your hand were to truly touch the atoms in a desk, that would be the scale of event you're looking at. Not a tap, more like a miniature explosion. So the fact that we never touch anything, it's a good thing. The boundaries between objects are maintained by that untouchable space. Now think about high jumps. You land. You don't sink through the ground. That's electromagnetic force again. The atoms in your feet and the ground push hard against each other. The ground isn't really solid in the way we think. It's stable. Not because the atoms are packed like bricks, but because the fields between them resist change. Your entire life happens because of things not touching. Holding hands, still no contact. Even when things feel close, skin on skin, it's fields reacting to each other. Resistance between tiny particles you'll never see. It's weird, but also consistent. It happens the same way every time. This isn't just theory, it's measurable. In physics labs, scientists use tools like atomic force microscopes to feel the repulsion between individual atoms. They never observe atoms colliding like billiard balls. Instead, they measure how the fields interact. When particles really do come close enough to overlap, the physics changes. You get quantum tunneling, uncertainty, or particle decay. At that point, you're in a space that doesn't follow the rules of touch at all. Even smell and taste, though they involve molecules landing on receptors, are about interaction, not touch. Molecules from food don't touch your taste buds. They bind in a temporary way, triggering reactions. But again, it's not contact, it's connection through chemical forces. Fire, that feels like it's touching you. But fire is just energy released from atoms changing states. It's not a thing pressing on your skin. It's atoms releasing heat and light as they break apart bonds. Your nerves react to the heat, not the flame. The pain is from energy, not pressure. Now consider sound. You hear someone speaking, or you feel bass vibrate through a floor. That vibration, it travels as pressure waves in air. But even then, the molecules don't hit your eardrum like bullets. They pass energy through air, one pushing on another, chain reaction style, without ever touching. It's a series of fields passing movement. Light works the same way. Photons travel through space and bounce off surfaces. They hit your retina. But again, it's not contact, it's absorption. Energy is transferred, not mass. No actual bumping happens. So next time you clap your hands, hold a cup, or tap your phone screen, remember what's really going on. You aren't making contact with the cup. You're stopping just short of it because your atoms refuse to overlap with the atoms of the cup. What you feel is the tension, a micro-scale standoff, a balance that never breaks. In a way, it makes everything feel slightly less real, but it also makes the world more stable. If atoms were constantly touching and merging, we'd have chaos. Objects would pass through each other. Identity would blur. Tables wouldn't hold you up. You couldn't stand. You couldn't sit. You might not exist as a solid body. We rely on not touching. It's what lets everything stay separate, balanced, and safe. So maybe it's time to redefine what touch means. It's not contact. It's resistance. It's your body's way of sensing the invisible wall between atoms. You aren't really touching anything. You're just feeling the edge of what's allowed. You know how people always say mistakes are the best teachers? We nod, agree, and even repeat it to others. But when it's our turn to make one, our stomach drops, our hands sweat, and our brain looks for the nearest exit. If mistakes really help us grow, why do we avoid them like danger? It starts early. A kid spills a glass of milk and hears, "Look what you've done." A student answers a question wrong in class and the room goes quiet. A teenager gets a bad grade, and someone asks, "Why didn't you try harder?" The message is simple. Mistakes are problems. Mistakes equal shame, not learning. So by the time we're adults, fear is baked in. But here's the twist. Your mind understands the value of mistakes. You know that every skill you've learned came with failure at the start. Walking meant falling. Speaking meant stumbling over words. Riding a bike meant tipping over. You learned each one by doing it wrong before doing it right. Your brain knows this, but your body doesn't care. It still reacts as if mistakes are threats. Let's break this down. Imagine you're in a meeting. You've got an idea, but you're not sure if it's solid. You could speak up and risk sounding off, or you could stay quiet and avoid the spotlight. Most people stay quiet, not because they don't want to learn, but because the fear of looking wrong outweighs the hope of being right. The cost of embarrassment feels heavier than the reward of insight. That's the instinct talking. Fear of mistakes doesn't live in reason. It lives in experience. Somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing errors as part of the process and started seeing them as proof of failure. In school, we get penalized for wrong answers, not rewarded for effort. In jobs, people get passed over if they're seen as unreliable, even if they were just trying something new. And in public, judgment is swift. Social media turns every misstep into a meme. You learn fast. Mistakes aren't just lessons, they're liabilities. But mistakes aren't equal. Some carry real weight. A surgeon can't afford the wrong incision. A pilot can't afford to guess. In high-risk work, mistakes are dangerous. But most of us live in spaces where the risk is social, not fatal. Giving a wrong answer, trying something new, or failing at a first attempt doesn't end your career. It just bruises your ego. Still, our reaction treats both kinds the same. Think about language learners. The fastest way to get fluent is to speak often and mess up often. Yet adults learning a language tend to hesitate. They wait until the sentence is perfect in their head. Then they speak. Kids, on the other hand, throw words around. They mess up grammar. They make up rules. But they improve quickly. Why? Because they don't care if they're wrong. They're not filtering every word through the fear of judgment. The same thing happens with creative work. Artists who try something new might ruin a canvas. Writers might throw away pages. Musicians might spend hours on a melody that leads nowhere. But all of that is part of getting somewhere. If they avoid the risk of a bad piece, they never reach a great one. Fear of making something bad can block them from making anything at all. There's also something strange about perfection. The closer you get to it, the more afraid you are of losing it. A student who always gets A's might fear trying a harder subject in case they get a B. A worker praised for their clean record might avoid taking a risk on a new system. Mistakes feel like they stain the image you've built, so you stick to the safe zones. But safe zones don't grow, they just repeat. Now imagine this. You're building something. A table, let's say. You measure, cut, sand, and drill. But you mess up the alignment. The legs wobble. It's frustrating. You have to undo it, remeasure, try again. But next time, you don't make the same mistake. The final table is solid. You don't even have to think about that alignment anymore. It's in your hands now. That mistake didn't just teach you the process. It became part of your muscle memory. You only had to mess it up once. That's what fear of mistakes hides from us. The fact that most errors don't need to happen twice. You touch a hot stove once. You don't need to write that down. You remember. But the same is true for softer lessons. You forget to save your project, and you lose hours of work. Next time, you hit Control-S like it's a reflex. The lesson sticks. We also assume other people are watching more than they are. You might think everyone remembers the time you mispronounced a word during a presentation, or when you posted something that didn't land. But people forget fast. Most are thinking about their own mistakes, not yours. The spotlight feels hot, but often no one's even looking. There's power in reframing. What if mistakes were just the cost of entry, like paying a toll to cross into a new skill? What if the only way to get better was to earn your way through error? Not avoid it, not bypass it, earn it. That mindset won't remove fear, but it might keep you moving despite it. Let's go even smaller. Think about games. Every game you've ever played taught you by punishing mistakes. You fell in a hole, so next time you jump earlier. You lost a level, so next time you plan better. Games don't shame you for messing up. They expect you to. That's how they're designed. You're not expected to beat a boss the first time. You're expected to die trying, learn the pattern, and come back stronger. What if life worked the same way? What if every bad attempt was just level 1? What if embarrassment wasn't a sign to stop, but a checkpoint to move past? You don't need to love mistakes. You just need to stop fearing them like monsters. They're not. They're mirrors. You see what's off, and then you fix it. You look again, and it's better. That's not failure, that's adjustment. And if you're afraid of making the same mistake twice, that's valid. But that's why reflection matters. It's not just about doing things wrong, it's about knowing why they went wrong. Then the next time comes and you walk in with more than you had before. That's how it adds up. Mistake by mistake, step by step. Fear says stop, but learning doesn't happen until you keep going. You're dreaming. You know it. Maybe you're flying, maybe you're underwater, maybe you're back in school late for a test you didn't study for. The rules feel loose, but real enough to follow. Then out of nowhere, someone dies. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone you know. And for a moment, just a second, it feels real. That snap of fear, that drop in your chest. Then you wake up, confused, sweaty, eyes wide. Here's the question. If someone dies in your dream, is that death happening in some other version of reality? A version you just stepped out of? A version that kept going without you? It's a simple question on the surface, but the more you think about it, the messier it gets. Let's start with what we know. In real life, we experience one timeline, one consciousness, one identity. In a dream, though, we can be many things. We can switch perspectives. We can be the watcher or the victim. We can even die and keep watching what happens next. In dreams, identity feels thinner, less fixed. Like we're playing a character we made up on the spot, And when that character dies, the story doesn't always stop. Now imagine this. You're dreaming that you're someone else, not just pretending, but fully in their skin. You think like them, move like them, feel things as they would. Then something happens, a crash, an attack, a fall. You die. The dream ends. Or maybe it doesn't. Maybe you keep watching the story unfold. But what if that character you were, the one who died, didn't vanish? What if in some way that version of you kept going, just without you being there to observe it? That's where the idea of a dream within a dream takes shape. Not like the movie Inception, where time slows and dreams stack like floors, more like a branching path. Your mind runs a simulation, something gets cut off, and a part of that reality slips away from your awareness, but continues on. It sounds far-fetched, but think about this. In your dreams, your brain creates entire worlds, people with names, faces you've never seen, cities that don't exist, rules that change, but somehow still make sense. When you wake up, you pull away from that world like it was nothing. But while you were in it, it felt real. If your dream self can feel pain, fear, joy, what does it mean when that version of you dies? Let's ground this in something practical. Have you ever had a dream where you fell from a great height? Right before you hit the ground, you jolt awake. You never actually see yourself die. Your mind yanks you out of the moment. Some say it's a defense mechanism. Others think the shock is what wakes you. But what if it's more like a thread breaking? What if the dream doesn't stop, but your awareness of it does? Here's another angle. Think about lucid dreaming. You know you're dreaming, and you can control things. You can fly, bend the environment, talk to dream characters. But sometimes, even in lucid dreams, things still happen that you didn't expect. The dream pushes back. People say they've been chased by dream figures they couldn't control. They've had entire storylines play out like a movie, even while knowing it wasn't real. That suggests the dream has its own kind of logic, its own internal timeline. So if a character dies in that dream and your point of view shifts or ends, maybe that story keeps going. Maybe in the framework of your subconscious, the dream has a branch that continues, even if you're not riding along with it. Some people believe dreams are doorways to parallel realities. The theory goes like this. Your mind connects to other versions of yourself in different universes. The dreams you have aren't made up. They're glimpses into other lives, other timelines. So when you die in a dream, you're not just simulating death, you're watching it happen to a version of you that actually exists somewhere else. In that case, your dream might be the last window into that version's world before the lights go out. It sounds like science fiction, and maybe it is, but consider how little we actually understand about consciousness. Neuroscience can explain electrical signals, REM cycles, and the role of the hippocampus, but it can't explain why we dream of things we've never seen, or why dreams can feel more real than waking life, or how we sometimes wake up remembering only pieces, as if we weren't meant to bring everything back with us. Now, here's something strange. Some people report having recurring dreams where a character dies and comes back in a later dream. It's not common, but it happens. The setting is the same. The rules are the same. It's like re-entering a paused video game, picking up where you left off. If your mind can re-access that world, who's to say it didn't keep running in the background? There's also the question of identity. Who are you in a dream? Are you you, or just a version that your brain stitched together for the night? If that version of you dies, is it just pixels vanishing? Or does some small part of your unconscious mind experience that as a real loss? And if that version of you kept going, if the dream world kept unfolding, where is it now? Some philosophies, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, suggest that dreams and the waking world are not so different. They teach that what you experience in dreams reflects the fluid nature of reality itself. The self is just a concept. Death is not the end, but a transition. So when you die in a dream, that version of you dissolves, but the story doesn't stop, it reshapes. It's also worth asking, why do we wake up after we die in a dream? Is it fear? Is it the brain refusing to simulate the unknown? Or is it something else, like a hand pulling you out before you see too much? You could spend hours on this question and never land on a clear answer. That's what makes it stick. The idea that your mind, while sleeping, might create an entire storyline, Let it play out to the point of death, then either let it go or keep it running without you. It's not just about what happens in dreams. It's about what dreams say about you, your sense of self, your awareness, your grip on what's real and what's not. Because if dreams can feel that real, what else could? You wake up and shrug it off. Just a dream, you tell yourself. But some part of you remembers the way it felt, the moment it ended, the part that didn't feel like fiction. And sometimes late at night when everything's quiet, you wonder if that dream kept going. If that version of you is still there, still dreaming, just without you. Let's say someone tells you nothing is impossible. It sounds inspiring, motivational, like anything can happen if you just try hard enough. But let's take a closer look at that phrase. What does it actually mean? When we say nothing is impossible, we're saying that every single thing, no matter how unlikely, strange, or contradictory, could happen. That includes things that, by their nature, can't happen. So here's the problem. If nothing is impossible, then the idea of something being impossible must also be possible, which breaks the whole thing. Imagine you say nothing is impossible, and then someone asks, okay, so is it possible that something is impossible? If you say yes, you've contradicted yourself. If you say no, then you're saying it's impossible for something to be impossible, which sounds like another loop. You're trapped. Let's put it into a real-world example. Suppose I tell you it's impossible to draw a square circle. The definition of a square and a circle conflict. A square has 4 straight edges and corners. A circle has none. The two shapes can't overlap. So according to the rules of geometry, a square circle can't exist. But now you tell me nothing is impossible. That would mean a square circle could exist somehow. But if it did, it would either stop being a square or stop being a circle. You can't have both at once. It's not about effort or imagination. It's about definitions that cancel each other out. This isn't about believing in yourself or trying new things. Those are great messages. But the phrase, nothing is impossible, goes beyond motivation and into logic. And logic doesn't bend the way feelings do. Let's try another situation. You say, it's impossible to be in 2 places at the same time. Most people would agree. We can't split our physical bodies into 2 and be present in both locations. That's the current limit of reality as we understand it. But then you repeat the phrase, nothing is impossible. If you believe that, then being in 2 places at once should be possible. But if it is, then it's not impossible. And if it's not impossible, then it shouldn't have been used to challenge the phrase in the first place. We go in circles again. The heart of the issue is in the word nothing. It means no thing, 0 things, absolutely none. If we apply it strictly, then we're not allowed to make exceptions. And that's what makes the sentence fold in on itself. The phrase, nothing is impossible, must include itself. That's what makes it self-referential. It's like saying, I always lie. If that sentence is true, then the person is lying, so it must be false. But if it's false, then maybe they're telling the truth. It's a closed loop that can't escape itself. Now imagine a world where everything truly was possible, not just the normal physical stuff, not just flying or teleporting or becoming invisible, but even things that cancel themselves out. Imagine you could be awake and asleep at the same time. Imagine you could say something is true and false at once. Imagine you could be alive and dead, not metaphorically, but literally. That world wouldn't make sense. Nothing would follow rules. Cause and effect would break down. There'd be no logic left to build anything on. You couldn't solve problems because problems wouldn't behave in consistent ways. A completely possibility-filled universe collapses under its own freedom. So in a way, impossibility creates structure. Limits define the edges of reality. They give things shape. Saying some things are impossible doesn't make us small. It just means we live in a world where certain truths are reliable. You can trust that the sun will rise, that 2 + 2 = 4, and that square circles won't show up in your driveway. It's also worth looking at how this phrase is used in conversation. Most of the time, when people say nothing is impossible, they're not talking about logical contradictions or physical laws. They mean, don't give up, or keep trying, or believe in yourself. And in that context, it makes emotional sense. But it's still different from literal truth. Just because something feels motivating doesn't make it logically sound. Here's another way to look at it. Imagine a teacher tells a class, "There's no such thing as a stupid question." It encourages curiosity. It creates a safe space. But it's not a literal rule of the universe. Some questions don't make sense. Some are based on false assumptions. So while the phrase sounds good, it's not strictly accurate. It works because we understand its intent, not because it holds up to technical analysis. Same with nothing is impossible. It works emotionally. It fails logically. Another example. Can I make a four-sided triangle? By definition, triangles have three sides. As soon as it has four, it stops being a triangle. So if you believe nothing is impossible, you have to accept the idea of a triangle with four sides. But you can't call it that anymore. It's now something else. This doesn't mean creativity should stop. It doesn't mean people shouldn't aim high. But it's important to separate language that inspires from language that describes reality. When you hear phrases like, "nothing is impossible," try asking yourself, what kind of impossible are we talking about? Is it something that breaks the rules of logic? Or is it something hard but doable, like climbing Everest or solving a Rubik's Cube blindfolded? One last twist. If you say nothing is impossible and someone points out a contradiction in your sentence and you say, "Well, that's not what I meant," then the phrase has already failed. Because now you're making exceptions, and nothing doesn't allow exceptions. That's the beauty and the trap of absolute statements. The more extreme they are, the more fragile they become. So maybe the real lesson isn't about believing in the impossible. It's about being careful with absolutes. They sound powerful, but they often can't hold their own weight. Sometimes saying some things are possible and some things aren't is just more honest. And in the end, truth, no matter how plain, gives us more to stand on than a paradox ever could. You wake up, stretch, and start your day. Everything feels normal. You brush your teeth, check your phone, maybe make some coffee. But what if none of it is real? What if you're still asleep and your mind is just filling in the blanks? It's a strange question, and most people dismiss it. Of course I'm awake, they think. But when you're dreaming, don't you usually think the same thing? That's the problem. In dreams, especially vivid ones, your brain simulates reality so well that you rarely question it. The streets look right. Your hands look like hands. People talk and move just like they do in real life. You might even feel pain, joy, embarrassment. Everything works as expected until something small feels off. Maybe the clock face melts. Maybe your childhood home is now a spaceship. Maybe someone you know has the wrong face. That's when you might notice, if you're lucky. Lucid dreamers have experienced this kind of realization before. They're in a dream, but suddenly they know it. They become aware that everything around them is fake. They realize their body is lying in bed somewhere else, completely still, while their brain runs a full simulation. This isn't science fiction. Studies have confirmed lucid dreaming as a real and measurable state. People inside lucid dreams can even signal to researchers by moving their eyes in specific patterns. But here's where it gets weird. For many lucid dreamers, that moment of realization doesn't come from anything magical. It starts with a small question. Wait a second, is this real? And if you've never asked yourself that in real life, how can you be sure this isn't one of those dreams right now? That's the trap. You assume reality is obvious, but your brain has fooled you before. It has made you feel gravity in your sleep. It has made you cry from fake loss. It has made you believe in impossible things and only told you the truth after you woke up. So how do you tell? One common trick is the reality check. In lucid dreaming circles, this means doing something simple that doesn't behave the same way in dreams. For example, trying to push your finger through your palm. In dreams, your brain doesn't always get physics right, and your hand might pass through. Another one is reading text. In dreams, words tend to shift or blur if you look away and look back. But the real question is, why do you need a trick at all? If being awake is so different from being asleep, shouldn't it be obvious? The truth is, it's not, and that's uncomfortable. Imagine this. You're sitting in a room. There's a book in front of you. You open it. The pages have words. You can read them. You can smell the paper. You turn a page, and it makes a soft crackling sound. A fan is spinning above you. It hums quietly. Everything looks normal. Now imagine you're dreaming. The same room, the same book, the same fan. Until you look at the clock and realize time is moving backwards. That's the giveaway. But without that one strange detail, you could stay in that dream forever, thinking it's real. Living an entire life, loving, working, growing old, and then suddenly, you wake up. There's a story people sometimes share in lucid dreaming communities. A man lived a full life in a dream. Decades passed. He had a family, a career. He went through joy and grief, and then he woke up in his real bedroom, and only 5 minutes had gone by. The loss was so intense that he cried. Not for what was real, but for the dream that felt like it had been everything. That's what makes this question stick. You can't rely on time or feelings or senses to tell you what's real. Your brain is capable of faking all of it. So again, how do you know you're not dreaming right now? You might be thinking, I can remember yesterday. I can remember my whole life. That's proof, right? Not really. Dreams often come with false memories. You might dream you've lived in a city your whole life, even if that city never existed. You might dream you have a job you never had. The dream fills in the gaps and builds a backstory instantly. It feels real while you're in it, just like your memories feel real right now. That's not to say you're dreaming now. Maybe you're not. Maybe everything around you is exactly as it seems. But the uncomfortable part is that you don't have a reliable test without doing something out of the ordinary. You just believe you're awake because you usually are. But usually doesn't mean always. Think about déjà vu, that eerie feeling that you've been in this moment before. You walk into a room and something tells you it's familiar, even if you've never seen it. People often brush it off. But if your brain can trick you into feeling familiarity without cause, it can probably trick you into feeling awake when you're not. There's another strange experience some people report. It's called false awakening. You wake up, start your day, and then you wake up again, and again, and again. It's like a loop. Each time you think this time is real, only to discover it isn't. It's exhausting. Some people go through 5 or 10 of these cycles in one night, and when they finally do wake up for real, they're terrified that it's just another layer. It's not just a dreamer's problem. This messes with your sense of certainty. If your brain can construct believable, complete realities without your permission, then what does it really mean to be conscious? What does real even mean? Try this. Look at your hands. Flex your fingers. Can you be sure this isn't a dream version of your body? Try to remember what happened 5 minutes ago. Can you trace the exact moment you fell asleep, if you even did? Try to breathe while holding your nose closed. In dreams, you might still be able to. These are tests people use to try and catch their own mind in the act. But even then, you might fail to notice the trick. You might not think to test anything at all, because it all feels so normal. That's the danger. It's not the strangeness of dreams that makes them hard to spot. It's how ordinary they feel. So next time you're doing something routine, washing dishes, driving, scrolling your phone, just stop and ask yourself, is this real? Or am I still asleep, dreaming about being awake? You probably won't have an answer, and that's the point. Sometimes the truth stings, not because it's cruel, but because it's real. You tell someone their work isn't good enough, and they feel crushed. You tell a friend their partner is cheating, and their world collapses. You say what needs to be said, and someone else walks away with a hole in their chest. That's the thing with truth. It doesn't ask how you feel about it. Now imagine this instead. You say nothing, or maybe you lie just a little. You tell them their work is solid, even when you know it isn't. You tell them you're sure everything's fine in their relationship, even though it's not. It's a small act, and in that moment they smile, they sleep better, they don't carry that weight. So which one was the right thing to do? Most people would say it depends. Depends on how big the lie is, depends on the reason behind it, depends on what happens next. And that's fair, because the line between kindness and manipulation is a thin one, and white lies walk it every day. Let's say your friend asks how they look in a new outfit. You don't like it. In fact, you think it makes them look uncomfortable, but you know they feel good in it. They're smiling, they're excited to go out. So what do you say? Do you tell them the truth and possibly ruin their mood? Or do you lie and say it looks great? If you lie, is that kindness? Or are you just avoiding an awkward moment? Maybe both. Maybe you don't want to hurt their feelings. Maybe you just don't want to deal with their reaction. That's where things get tricky. Because sometimes a lie feels like love, but really, it's just convenience. Let's go deeper. A doctor knows a patient has a terminal illness. The patient asks if everything's going to be okay. The doctor knows the odds are terrible, but the patient is scared, clinging to hope. Should the doctor lie to ease their fear or tell them the harsh reality? In real life, doctors sometimes soften the truth. They don't always say, "You've got 3 months left." They say, "Let's take it one day at a time." They leave room for comfort. Is that a white lie? Probably. But is it wrong? That depends on what you believe honesty is for. If truth is about giving people full control over their own lives, then any lie, no matter how kind, takes away that control, even a small one. You rob them of the chance to prepare, to choose, to act based on reality. But if you think truth should be shaped by love, by context, by what a person can handle, then lying sometimes isn't betrayal. It's protection. Here's another case. A child asks about death. They ask what happens when people die. They ask where grandma went. Most parents don't say she decomposed underground and her organs shut down. They say something else. Maybe she went to heaven. Maybe she's watching over us. Maybe she's sleeping forever. Those are soft lies. Are they bad, or are they simply tools to help a child understand something their brain isn't ready to handle? That's the argument in favor of white lies. They're stepping stones, temporary comfort. They don't replace the truth forever. They just delay it until someone is strong enough to carry it. But even then, there's risk, because lies have momentum. One white lie can lead to another. You tell a friend their partner is great when you know they're cheating. Now later, when it all falls apart, that friend doesn't just feel betrayed by the partner. They feel betrayed by you. You knew. You said nothing. You said it was fine. That's the hidden damage of kind lies. They seem harmless in the moment, but later they can break trust, twist reality, and leave someone asking if anything you said was ever real. And yet, we still tell them. We tell them because humans don't just communicate information. We manage emotion. We try to protect the people we love. We try to keep things stable. We try to avoid pain for them and for ourselves. That's why white lies happen. Now think about someone who never lies, not even a little. They say exactly what they think all the time. No filters, no sugarcoating. You might say they're honest, or you might say they're cruel, because truth without care can feel like a weapon. It cuts clean, and not everyone is ready to bleed. So then, what's better? A soft lie or a hard truth? There's no single answer, but maybe the better question is, who benefits more from the lie, you or them? If the lie protects you from discomfort, then it's not kindness, it's avoidance. But if the lie buys them time, helps them breathe, or helps them face something difficult later on their own terms, then maybe, just maybe, it's a form of grace. Still, even good intentions have limits, because sooner or later, the truth tends to come out. And when it does, people don't just remember the lie, they remember who lied. They ask, "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me to handle it?" So, lying with love isn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. It's a gamble. You're betting on what someone else can handle, what they need, and whether the temporary peace is worth the long-term fallout. In everyday life, these choices happen fast. You don't get time to weigh all the variables. Your friend asks, "Are you mad at me?" You say no, even when you are. Your partner asks, "Is everything okay?" You say yes, when it's not. Those aren't lies told to protect them. They're lies told to delay a fight, to avoid a deeper talk. That's where white lies lose their innocence. But not every truth needs to be brutal. You don't have to say, "You look terrible in that outfit." You can say, "I think the other one fit you better." You can tell the truth gently. You can be honest without being harsh, and in most cases, that's better than lying or pretending. Still, life isn't simple. People are messy, feelings run deep, and sometimes the cleanest answer just doesn't work. You'll face moments where the truth might cause more pain than it solves, and you'll face others where the lie feels easy but wrong. In those moments, the real question isn't whether the lie is kind, it's whether it's fair. Whether it respects the other person's right to know, to feel, to choose. Because kindness without respect turns into control. And when a lie starts shaping someone else's life, even if it comes from love, it stops being soft. It starts being selfish. So when the truth hurts and the lie feels kind, the question isn't which one is easier. It's which one honors the person in front of you. Not just their feelings, but their freedom. Imagine a forest, completely still. There's no one around. No hikers, no cameras, not even animals close enough to witness what happens next. Suddenly, a tall tree, maybe an old pine, starts to crack. The trunk splits under its own weight and the tree crashes to the ground. Branches snap, leaves scatter, and the ground shakes with the impact. Now here's the question. Did that falling tree make a sound? It feels like the answer should be obvious. Of course it made a sound, right? Trees don't fall silently. You can imagine the creaking wood, the final snap, the loud crash. But then again, if no one was there to hear it, how can we be sure any sound happened at all? This question isn't really about trees or forests. It's about what we mean by the word sound. When you say something makes a sound, are you talking about vibrations moving through the air? Or are you talking about the moment those vibrations hit your ears and your brain processes them? Let's break it down. Physically speaking, when the tree falls, it pushes against the air. The movement of the tree creates pressure waves, vibrations, that travel outward. Those waves are what we typically define as sound waves. You don't need a person for that part to happen. Just like lightning creates a pressure wave we call thunder, or a rock splashing into water causes ripples, the falling tree creates a disturbance in the air. So in terms of physics, yes, the tree makes a sound. The air vibrates. The waves travel through the forest, bouncing off trees and the ground. If you had a microphone sitting nearby, it would pick up those waves and record them. Play back the tape later, and you'd hear the fall. But there's another side to this. Some people argue that sound only happens when it's heard. According to this idea, sound isn't just air pressure or vibration, it's the experience of hearing. If no one is around to receive those vibrations, then no sound happens. It's just motion in the air, waiting for ears that never arrive. That brings us to a deeper idea, perception. If no one hears it, does the event even exist in the way we think of it? Of course, the tree still falls. That much is clear. But does the fall include sound if sound needs a listener? This question sits in the strange space between science and philosophy. Scientists can tell you about the vibrations, the frequency of the waves, the energy released when the tree hits the ground. But science doesn't usually deal with subjective experience, what it's like to hear something. That's where the philosophical part comes in. You might think this is just wordplay, but it gets more interesting when you apply it to things outside forests. Take music, for example. You can say a song exists as a file on your phone, but until you press play and hear it, does the music really exist? Is it still music or just data? A song needs to be heard to be experienced as music. The same applies to color. We say apples are red, but red is only red because of how our eyes and brains interpret light. Without a human to see it, red isn't red, it's just light at a certain wavelength. Color, like sound, is part of how we experience the world, not necessarily something the world has on its own. Now think about silence. If the tree doesn't make a sound, is the forest silent? Or is silence just the absence of perceived noise? And if there's no one around to be aware of that silence, does it exist at all? That might sound strange, but it touches on how we define things, not just by what they are, but by how we relate to them. Let's shift back to the forest. Imagine you're there now. You hear the tree fall, and your brain processes the vibrations as sound. That moment, the crunch, the snap, the heavy thud, feels real and undeniable. You experienced it, but someone 5 miles away didn't. For them, that sound didn't exist. For them, the event might as well have been silent. So now the question becomes, is sound a physical event, or is it a personal one? This leads into a bigger question about reality itself. How much of what we call real depends on someone being there to experience it? Does the moon exist if no one sees it? Does pain exist if no one feels it? What about time? Does a second pass if nothing notices it? Those are big questions, and there aren't easy answers, but they all echo the same core idea. What's the difference between the world as it is and the world as we know it? Back to the tree. Let's say you place a sound sensor near the spot where the tree might fall. The sensor doesn't think or feel. It just records data. If the tree falls and the sensor picks up vibrations, you could play them back later. When you listen, you'd hear what the tree sounded like when it fell. So clearly, the sound was there, waiting for you. But if no sensor was there, no microphone, no living thing with ears and a brain, then all that energy, the pressure waves, the vibrating air, would move through the forest and disappear. No one would ever know it happened. Does that still count as sound? Some philosophers argue that everything we know is filtered through perception. If no one perceives an event, it doesn't fully exist in the way we normally think. Others argue that the universe doesn't care whether we're watching or not. Trees fall, stars explode, particles move, all with or without observers. Here's a final way to look at it. Suppose you build a robot that can hear. It doesn't think like we do, but it reacts to sound waves. If it hears the tree fall, does that count? Is it enough that something reacts? Or must the thing reacting understand what sound is? You could take it even further. What if the sound waves bounce off another tree and cause an animal to twitch in its sleep? That's a reaction. Does that mean the sound happened even if the animal wasn't fully awake? There are layers here, and none of them give a single final answer. That's what makes this such a classic and compelling question. You can choose to see it as a physics question and say, yes, the tree made a sound. Or you can see it as a question about perception and say, no, sound needs a listener. Or maybe, just maybe, both views are true in their own ways. And that's okay. We don't always need to close the loop. Sometimes it's enough to sit with the question, that quiet space between knowing and not knowing. That's where all the good thinking lives. Imagine you're watching a video, someone's talking, maybe laughing, and then they blink. You pause the video right in the middle of that blink. What do you see? One eye open, one eye closed. And that moment, frozen on your screen, starts to look like something else. It's no longer a blink, it looks exactly like a wink. And as long as the video stays paused, they'll stay in that exact pose. One eye open, one eye shut, no change, no movement, just a permanent wink. Now think about what a wink is. It's not just one eye closed, it's the intention behind it. A wink can be playful, secretive, sometimes even awkward. But here, in a paused video, the person has no intention. They're not winking on purpose, they were blinking, just doing something their body does automatically, like breathing or swallowing. But now to you, it looks like something else entirely. The longer you stare at that paused image, the more real the wink seems. It doesn't matter what they meant to do. It matters what you see. Your brain fills in the gaps. This happens all the time. We take a frozen moment, a still image, and we attach meaning to it. But that meaning isn't always what was actually there. It's what we've decided is there. And in this case, what we've decided is simple. This person is winking. The video is paused, so nothing changes. The eye doesn't open. The moment doesn't end. So how long do they keep winking? As long as you leave the video paused. 5 seconds? 10 minutes? An hour? Forever, if you want. This is where the thought gets a little strange, because in reality, that person blinked for maybe a third of a second. But you've stretched that blink out into eternity. You've turned a moment into a state. A quick, passing action has become something that lasts without end. And you can't tell the difference just by looking at the screen. So what's really happening here? You've captured a frame, a single slice of time, and you've frozen it. You've locked the person into a position they never meant to hold. They're not blinking anymore. They're not moving. They're just stuck there in this half blink, looking like they're winking at you. Not just for now, for as long as the image stays frozen. Think about other things that work the same way. You pause someone mid-sneeze and it looks ridiculous. You freeze someone mid-laugh and suddenly their face looks distorted, maybe even upset. One frame changes the entire meaning of what happened, and once it's paused, you can't unsee it. The frame becomes the whole story, even though it's only a part of it. That's how our brains work. We take snapshots and assume they show the full picture, but most of the time they don't. They just show one tiny piece. The blink is no longer a blink, it's a wink. It was a normal expression. Now it's flirtatious or ironic or just strange. Now let's zoom out. This is more than just a video trick. It's a way of thinking about time, about perception, about what it means for something to be happening. Is the person really winking, or are they only winking in your mind? Are they doing anything at all, or have you just imposed a meaning onto a moment? The frame doesn't change. Your mind does. You decide what it means. You start to tell a story around it. And that story sticks, even when you know better. Even when you remember that this was just a blink, paused mid-motion, and not a wink at all. Here's another layer. Let's say you show the paused video to someone else. They don't know what happened before or after. They just see the image. What do they say? Oh, that person's winking. They see the same thing you do. They assign the same meaning. The illusion spreads. And just like that, one frame becomes the truth, at least in the eyes of whoever sees it. This kind of thing happens outside of videos too. In photographs, in quotes taken out of context, in memories. We take a single moment and hold on to it. We assign value to it. We say, this is what it meant, and we build a whole story around that 1 second of time. But that second didn't mean anything on its own. It was part of a flow, a blink inside a conversation, a breath between words, a look that passed as fast as it came. You paused it, you gave it meaning, you turned a blink into a wink. You could unpause the video, let the eye finish closing, then open again. Let the person move, speak, laugh. The wink disappears. The moment is gone. And it goes back to what it really was, nothing special, just a blink. But while the video's paused, it's something else, something lasting. The strange part is that this isn't even a trick, it's just how things work. The camera sees everything in frames. YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, even real life if you think in memories. All these moments are split into images, one frame at a time. And when you pause, you turn time into space. You take something that was moving and you trap it. You flatten it into a single shape. A person mid-blink becomes a person mid-wink. Not because they changed, but because you stopped time and decided what it meant. And maybe that's the whole idea. You can pause time, but when you do, the meaning you assign to it might not match reality. It might just be your best guess, or your brain's way of filling in the silence. You don't just see the image, you read it, you turn it into a message. So what is that person doing in the paused video? Are they blinking, winking, stuck, resting, waiting? You can't ask them. You can't rewind the thought. You can only look, decide, and live with the version you've created in your mind. As long as the frame is frozen, they'll keep winking. Not because they chose to, but because that's what a moment becomes when you stop it. A permanent version of something that was never meant to last. Imagine you have a list. That list contains things like apples, chairs, maybe another list. Nothing strange so far. But now ask this, can a list include itself? This might feel like a trick question. A list is just a collection. If it can hold other lists, why not itself? You might picture a box that holds smaller boxes, and one of the boxes is the big box itself. But that's where the trouble begins. This idea sits at the heart of a famous puzzle in logic called Russell's paradox. It comes from a simple thought. What if we look at all sets that don't include themselves? Think of a set like a bucket. Some buckets hold apples, others hold rocks. Some buckets may hold other buckets. Now think of a special bucket. It holds every bucket that does not hold itself. The question is, does this bucket hold itself? If it does, then by definition it shouldn't. It only holds buckets that don't hold themselves. But if it doesn't hold itself, then it fits the rule. It should hold itself. Either way, you hit a contradiction. It's like asking, can the rule include itself as an exception? It turns back on itself. It creates a logical loop. And once you're in that loop, there's no clean way out. This paradox isn't just a strange game with words. It caused real problems in early mathematics and logic. Before this was discovered, mathematicians were trying to build a system where all of math could be reduced to simple rules about sets. The idea was that sets could define everything, from numbers to functions to equations. It was clean and promising, until this paradox broke it. Let's walk through a real-world version. Say there's a barber in town. He shaves everyone who does not shave themselves. The question is, does the barber shave himself? If he does, he shouldn't, because he only shaves those who don't shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he needs a shave from the barber. That's him. So again, contradiction. This kind of loop, the self-referencing kind, is what creates the paradox. It happens when a rule tries to apply to itself. And the deeper you go, the harder it is to tell what's being described and what's doing the describing. Another way to think about it is like a dictionary that defines every word in the language. But now, try to define the word dictionary using only the words inside it. You start chasing your own tail. The the thing explaining itself becomes tangled. Back to sets. Most sets are harmless. A set of cats, a set of socks, a set of sets that include only red things. But then you get to these tricky, slippery sets, the ones that refer to themselves or exclude themselves or both. They don't play well with the rules. To prevent that loop, modern set theory added some restrictions. It now says that some collections just aren't sets. They're too messy. You can't have the set of all sets. That's like trying to draw a map of everything, including the map itself. You'll always miss something, or worse, you'll fold the map into itself until it disappears. This paradox shows that even simple ideas can collapse under their own weight. A set is just a collection. But once you let it include itself, you invite it to question its own boundaries. People sometimes ask if this has anything to do with consciousness. Like, can the mind observe itself? Can a thought think about the thought it's thinking? These are deep questions, and they echo the same kind of structure, a system turning inward, trying to include itself. Software sometimes hits similar walls. Recursive loops, where a function calls itself again and again, can break a program if not managed right. You end up with stack overflow, memory errors, or infinite processing. That's the machine version of what this paradox does in logic. Even language runs into it. The sentence, "This sentence is false," causes the same trouble. If it's true, then it's false. But if it's false, then it's true. That sentence loops in the same way the set does. Some thinkers tried to get around the paradox by making different levels of language or logic. One level can talk about regular things. Another level can talk about the rules of the first. But once you let the levels talk about themselves, it happens again. The same twist, the same fold, the same loop. And it's not just a technical issue. It changes how we think about rules and systems. If a rule applies to itself, what stops it from breaking itself? And if it doesn't apply to itself, is it really universal? This sounds abstract, but it shows up in daily life too. A law that governs all laws. A leader who controls who gets to be a leader. A camera that films itself filming. Each one raises the same question: can something hold itself? It also makes us ask about identity. If something includes itself, does it stop being distinct? A club with the rule, "No member can be part of this club," becomes empty. Or worse, it becomes paradoxical. One member walks in and suddenly the rule collapses. So when we ask, can a set contain itself, we're really asking if systems can handle self-reference. Can logic keep its footing when it looks in the mirror? Russell's answer was no, at least not without new rules. And that answer reshaped math, logic, and the foundations of computing. The idea that something can become unstable just by including itself, that a loop in logic can cause the whole system to crash, is still one of the simplest and strangest truths we've ever found.